show us. We don't have control of these live pictures, obviously, but South Africa's legal team is there as well. And they are waiting, as we are, for the World Court to hand down a ruling in the war between Israel and Hamas. In this interim ruling, the justices will decide whether to implement South Africa's request for emergency measures. Let's bring in Dominic Velitis, who's following along with us and the hearing today. Dominic, just give us the core issue here. What will the ICJ be ruling on today?
Well, you're quite right, Heather. This is an interim ruling, and the court is ruling on South Africa's plea for a series of provisional measures designed to protect the Palestinian people in Gaza and prevent the situation there from escalating. The South Africans essentially are asking for 9 measures in total, Heather, and among them are 2 key demands: that Israel suspend all military operations in Gaza and facilitates and does not impede the delivery of humanitarian aid into the territory. It's important to point out, Heather, that the court is not ruling today on the big core question, the big core issue of whether Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. That's a process that's likely to take several years. Some legal experts say 3 to 5 years. Rather, these provisional measures are more like a kind of restraining order on Israel while that wider case is being considered. And in determining whether provisional measures should be introduced, the 17 judges at the ICJ, which include 1 Israeli and 1 South African judge, they will decide if South Africa has done enough to show that the claims they're making under the Genocide Convention are plausible and whether Palestinians in Gaza face a real and imminent risk of harm. Now, if the judges decide that that bar has been reached, and the legal threshold, I have to say, is far lower for that than the one required to uphold South Africa's overall case, then the judges will determine which measures should be introduced to protect civilian life. Now, the court can be flexible in deciding what measures it introduces, Heather. It's not bound to order exactly what South Africa has requested. It can formulate measures, pick and choose, if you like, those measures which it deems most appropriate. Heather.
Dominic Velitis, thank you. Please stay with me and watch together, and you'll be part of our coverage following the hearing and the ruling from the International Court of Justice. I want to bring in a special guest who's going to join us throughout today and the moment we are about to witness together. Kenneth Roth is a former executive director of the Human Rights Watch. He is in Geneva and going to be my guest for the next few minutes. Welcome to our program. I'm delighted to have you with me today, sir.
It's good to be here.
You were listening to Dominic, and I'll get back to you on the substance here, but could I begin with your assessment, Ken, of the weight of this moment and the decision we are awaiting from the ICJ?
Well, this could make an enormous difference for Palestinian civilian life. And we're all aware that 25,000 Palestinians have been killed since October 7th. There have been aspects of the Israeli campaign that South Africa brought up. The indiscriminate bombardment, the use of huge bombs in heavily populated areas, the large-scale siege, this leading to starvation. Theoretically, the court could order an end to all or a significant part of that, and that could make a big, big difference for Palestinians who are stuck in Gaza.
And Dominic, you just heard him reporting as he laid out what is going to happen today, what the court is ruling on. And I think it's important for you and I to stress throughout, this is not on the broad core question of whether Israel is committing genocide, as South Africa alleges. This is on these key elements of, firstly, Ken, does the court have jurisdiction in this matter? Correct? That's the starting point for their deliberations.
Well, I mean, that's the starting point, but that actually is pretty straightforward. They have jurisdiction under the Genocide Convention. But I think, as you note, that this is not a ruling on the merits. The court will not decide today whether Israel is committing genocide or not. As Dominic mentioned, the standard is actually quite a bit lower. It's simply, did South Africa make a plausible case of genocide sufficient to require what are known as provisional measures, or basically, a protective order to try to avoid further harm from this plausible genocide being carried out.
Okay.
So that's what's at stake today.
So there's the legal threshold, possibility, potential, plausibility of whether this would fall under the scope of the Genocide Convention, and therefore that would lead, that finding, that determination would lead to whether they enact any of these emergency measures. What do you think? Well, as we're looking at the legal teams, and I want to come back to you in terms of what you heard. But I want to ask you, number one, in terms of what your expectation is, in terms of what you think the likelihood the court is going to rule here.
Well, I should say I have no special insight here, so this is just a prediction. But I did watch the full argument 2 weeks ago, 3 hours by each side. And, the Israeli defense, some of them were kind of irrelevant. They said this is an action of self-defense. Hamas attacked us. But, the point is you can't defend yourself by committing genocide. So that's kind of beside the point. They similarly said, Hamas is genocidal in its intent. But that's not a defense if Israel also is committing genocide. But where it got more serious is Israel really in 2 areas. One, they said, Hamas is using human shields, so the civilian harm is all its fault. But that doesn't explain, why Israel repeatedly is using these huge 2,000-pound bombs in civilian areas, which are just known to have a devastating effect. And that was a big point South Africa made. Okay. Similarly, Israel said, we're letting in food, but they didn't really address the huge bureaucratic obstacles that are leading to what everybody says is widespread starvation. So, those are the holes in Israel's case.
It was when we heard from Israel in those 3 hours, not so much contesting the evidence, but attacking South Africa. And we heard them say South Africa is the legal wing of Hamas, committing blood libel, and presented a partial and deeply flawed picture of what is going on. I'm wondering, for Israel, this particular conundrum maybe, in that it chose not to boycott this court. It chose to appear and argue. Therefore, if the court finds today against Israel, does that mean Israel has to abide?
Well, if the court finds against Israel, Israel has to abide, period.
Right.
But of course, the court has no enforcement power. It doesn't have a police force. It can only rely on the UN Security Council, where the U.S. traditionally exercises its veto to protect Israel. But I think, as you're pointing out, the fact that Israel chose to argue, and really it had to, because if it didn't show up, the likelihood of losing would be much, much greater. But the fact that it shows up, it can't say, oh, we respect the court if we win, we don't respect the court if we lose. So there's going to be big political pressure on Israel to abide by an adverse ruling.
So you see Israel there in the background, the legal team, which argued. In the foreground now, these are South Africa's lawyers, and we are awaiting the 17 judges. As far as South Africa, when it made its 3-hour arguments before this court, you mentioned, Ken, at the beginning, the things that it laid out in terms of the number of lives lost, the numbers according to the Gaza Health Ministry, the destruction and devastation within Gaza. But there was an awful lot of evidence that spoke to a legal issue of incitement right at the top levels of government. And as I've been reading various expert perspectives on all of this, it's what people like the defense minister and the prime minister said that may be of interest for us to pay attention to today. Can you speak to that?
Yes. These statements were brought up actually not formally in terms of incitement, but rather in terms of evidence of genocidal intent. Because under the Genocide Convention, it's not enough simply to kill a lot of people, but you have to do that with the intention of eradicating in whole or in part the relevant group here. And so the South African lawyers cited, a bunch of examples, but not just low-level people. They cited the defense minister, as you know, who referred to everybody in Gaza as human animals. Now, he's come back and said, oh, I just meant Hamas, but he was talking about the siege, which affects everybody. They cited Netanyahu, the prime minister, who invoked the biblical story of Amalek, where there's an injunction to kill every man, woman, child, and animal. They invoked the president, Herzog, who said there are no innocent civilians. And then they actually showed this chilling video of a bunch of Israeli soldiers singing and dancing that there are no innocent civilians, as if they heard this message. So these are this is the tough evidence Israel is dealing with. Now, Israel apparently has submitted a series of orders in confidence where they say, look, these orders said respect the Geneva Conventions, don't kill civilians if you can avoid it. But we don't really know, was it a comprehensive list of orders? Probably not. Probably they were cherry picking. And certainly there have been elements of what clearly looks like very deliberate Israeli action, whether it's attacking civilian institutions like universities or using, as I mentioned, these huge 2,000-pound bombs, which, and just to put it in perspective, the U.S., hasn't used for decades in populated areas. They're just seen as, far too destructive. And the New York Times found that Israel used them 200 times just in southern Gaza, where they told all Palestinian civilians to flee for safety. So, these are tough pieces of evidence that the selective orders, may not be sufficient to overcome, but we'll have to look to the judge's assessment.
So again, this is what we heard both first from South Africa on the 11th of January, from Israel on the 12th, 3 hours for each of the countries to make their position. And since the judges have been deliberating, I believe the camera must be, Ken, on this door, because we'll be awaiting the panel of judges to arrive. 15 judges on the panel officially. It's headed by a president, Judge Joan Donoghue, who's from the United States. But then both sides added an ad hoc judge. So Israel added the most famous judge in Israel, a Holocaust survivor. South Africa added a judge, the former Deputy Chief of Justice, who is very respected as a Constitutional Court judge, served on Robben Island along with Nelson Mandela, interestingly. So those two joined the 15. Can you just give us a feel for these workings? Would they have had arguments themselves? Would the two ad hoc members, would they have been able to try to persuade in any of the deliberations? How does it work to get to that majority opinion today, Ken?
They do have deliberations, whether orally or in writing, it's kind of up to them. The two ad hoc judges are full participants. Those are the rules. So they're not there as lawyers. The lawyers are the people we see on the screen right now. They're there just kind of a sense of fairness that, if governments don't already have a judge on the court, then they're allowed to appoint one. So these 17 judges are, in essence, the world Supreme Court. They're going to deliberate based on the evidence put before them. And, we'll hear momentarily how they come out on it.
And again, it was to begin at 7. We're just a little bit late, but we're going to stay with you. You're watching CBC Morning Live, and you're looking at pictures inside the courtroom at the International Court of Justice as we await that court's decision, not on the main ruling of whether Israel has committed genocide in Gaza. That is a ruling that could take investigation and years. 3 to 4 years is the estimate that many seem to have landed on. This is an interim ruling, whether the court has jurisdiction to rule in this area, and then, if so, whether it's going to call for emergency provisional measures, actions on the part of Israel to limit its activity in Gaza in its war with Hamas. Ken, the makeup of this panel, I'll just run through the 15 countries because it's interesting. The U.S. has the president, Russia, China, France, Australia, Brazil, Germany, India, Jamaica, Japan, Lebanon, Morocco. What does that tell you? I mean, the makeup of the panel hearing this particular question. Are there is it strictly legal considerations? Are there political considerations at play here? What is your assessment?
Well, this is supposed to be a judicial body where the judges do not represent their countries. This is not like the General Assembly where everybody's clearly voting as their country.
But here they're coming in, so we'll just keep talking as we watch, but here are the judges as they arrive. So go ahead, Ken.
So they're supposed to look at the law objectively and apply it. They're not supposed to be representing their governments. Now, can a judge ever escape their national background? Yes and no. They're all human beings. But this is, very different from just imagining a typical UN body where they await instructions from the Capitol and then vote accordingly. These are people who don't hold the Capitol. They are just, deciding among themselves based on their legal background, their legal expertise. We'll have to see, how this comes out and whether it breaks down according to nationality. I think it's interesting that the big case against Israel in the past, the only negative vote, the only vote for Israel was actually the U.S. judge. So, there is a tendency to consider national background, but that is not supposed to be decisive at all. It's not even supposed to be a factor.
The President, Joan Donoghue, is going to be reading this. We understand it could take 45 minutes, up to an hour and a half. So, Ken, if you would, you're going to watch. I will watch with you, and thank you so much for setting this up with me as we understand this singular moment in this case, and let us listen in live.
Case concerning application of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in the Gaza Strip, South Africa versus Israel. Judge Robinson, who duly participated in both the deliberation and the final vote, is, for reasons made known to me, unable to take his seat on the bench today. I would like to welcome the eminent representatives of the Republic of South Africa and the State of Israel who are in the Great Hall of Justice today. In particular, I recognize the presence of Her Excellency, Ms. Naledi Pandor, Minister of International Relations and Cooperation of the Republic of South Africa. I recall that on 29 December 2023, South Africa filed in the Registry of the Court an application instituting proceedings against Israel concerning alleged violations in the Gaza Strip of obligations under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, to which I shall refer as the Genocide Convention or the Convention. The application of South Africa contained a request for the indication of provisional measures submitted with reference to Article 41 of the statute and to Articles 73, 74, and 75 of the Rules of Court. In accordance with the usual practice, I shall not read the introductory paragraphs of the order which set out the procedural history of the case. I shall also omit or summarize some other paragraphs. I shall therefore begin the reading of the order at paragraph 13. In the order, the Court begins by recalling the immediate context in which the present case came before it. It observes that on 7 October 2023, Hamas and other armed groups present in the Gaza Strip carried out an attack in Israel, killing more than 1,200 persons, injuring thousands, and abducting some 240 people, many of whom continue to be held hostage. Following this attack, Israel launched a large-scale military operation in Gaza by land, air, and sea, which is causing massive civilian casualties, extensive destruction of civilian infrastructure, and the displacement of the overwhelming majority of the population in Gaza. The Court is acutely aware of the extent of the human tragedy that is unfolding in the region and is deeply concerned about the continuing loss of life and human suffering. The ongoing conflict in Gaza has been addressed in the framework of several organs and specialized agencies of the United Nations. In particular, reservations have been adopted by the General Assembly and the Security Council of the United Nations, referring to many aspects of the conflict. The scope of the present case submitted to the Court, however, is limited, as South Africa has instituted these proceedings under the Genocide Convention. The Court then turns to the conditions needed to be fulfilled in order for it to indicate provisional measures. With respect to the question of prima facie jurisdiction, the Court observes that it may indicate provisional measures only if the provisions relied on by the applicant appear prima facie to afford a basis on which its jurisdiction could be founded, but it need not satisfy itself in a definitive manner that it has jurisdiction as regards the merits of the case. In the present case, South Africa seeks to found the jurisdiction of the Court on Article 36, Paragraph 1 of the Statute of the Court and on Article 9 of the Genocide Convention. The Court must therefore first determine whether those provisions prima facie confer upon it jurisdiction to rule on the merits of the case, enabling it, if the other necessary conditions are fulfilled, to indicate provisional measures. Article 9 of the Genocide Convention provides, I quote, "Disputes between the contracting parties relating to the interpretation, application, or fulfillment of the present convention, including those relating to the responsibility of a state for genocide or for any of the other acts enumerated in Article 3, shall be submitted to the International Court of Justice at the request of any of the parties to the dispute." End of quote. South Africa and Israel are both parties to the Genocide Convention, and neither of them has entered a reservation to Article 9 or any other provision of the Convention. The Court then recalls that Article 9 of the Genocide Convention makes its jurisdiction conditional on the existence of a dispute relating to the interpretation, application, or fulfillment of the Convention. A dispute is a disagreement on a point of law or fact, a conflict of legal views or of interest between parties. In order for a dispute to exist, it must be shown that the claim of one party is positively opposed by the other. The two sides must hold clearly opposite views concerning the question of the performance or non-performance of certain international obligations. To determine whether a dispute exists in the present case, the Court cannot limit itself to noting that one of the parties maintains the Convention applies while the other denies it. Since South Africa has invoked as a basis for the Court's jurisdiction the compromissory clause of the Genocide Convention, the Court must also ascertain at the present stage of the proceedings whether it appears that the acts and omissions complained of by the applicant are capable of falling within the scope of that convention, ratio materiae. The Court recalls that for purposes of deciding whether a dispute existed between the parties at the time of the filing of the application, it takes into account in particular any statements or documents exchanged between the parties, as well as any exchanges made in multilateral settings. In so doing, it pays special attention to the author of the statement or document, its intended or actual addressee, and its content. The existence of a dispute is a matter for objective determination by the Court. It is a matter of substance, not a question of form or procedure. The Court notes that South Africa issued public statements in various multilateral and bilateral settings in which it expressed its view that, in light of the nature, scope, and extent of Israel's military operations in Gaza, Israel's actions amounted to violations of its obligations under the Genocide Convention. For instance, at the resumed 10th Emergency Special Session of the United Nations General Assembly on 12 December 2023, at which Israel was represented, the South African representative to the United Nations stated that, I quote, "The events of the past 6 weeks in Gaza have illustrated that Israel is acting contrary to its obligations in terms of the Genocide Convention." End of quote. South Africa recalled this statement in its note verbal of 21 December 2023 to the Embassy of Israel in Pretoria. The Court notes that Israel dismissed any accusation of genocide in the context of the conflict in Gaza in a document published by the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs on 6 December 2023, which was subsequently updated and reproduced on the website of the Israel Defense Forces on 15 December 2023 under the title, "The War Against Hamas, Answering Your Most Pressing Questions," stating that, I quote, "The accusation of genocide against Israel is not only wholly unfounded as a matter of fact and law, it is morally repugnant." End of quote. In the document, Israel also stated that, I quote, "The accusation of genocide is not just legally and factually incoherent, it is obscene, and that there was no valid basis in fact or law for the outrageous charge of genocide." End of quote. In light of the foregoing, the Court considers that the parties appear to hold clearly opposite views as to whether certain acts or omissions allegedly committed by Israel in Gaza amount to violations by the latter of its obligations under the Genocide Convention. The Court finds that the aforementioned elements are sufficient at this stage to establish prima facie the existence of a dispute between the parties relating to the interpretation, application, or fulfillment of the Genocide Convention. As to whether the acts and omissions complained of by the applicant appear to be capable of falling within the provisions of the Genocide Convention, the Court recalls that South Africa considers Israel to be responsible for committing genocide in Gaza and for failing to prevent and punish genocidal acts. South Africa contends that Israel has also violated other obligations under the Genocide Convention, including those concerning conspiracy to commit genocide, direct and public incitement to genocide, attempted genocide, and complicity in genocide. At the present stage of the proceedings, the Court is not required to ascertain whether any violations of Israel's obligations under the Genocide Convention have occurred. Such a finding could only be made by the Court at the stage of the examination of the merits of the present case. At the stage of making an order on the request for an indication of provisional measures, the court's task is to establish whether the acts and omissions complained of by the applicant appear to be capable of falling within the provisions of the Genocide Convention. In the court's view, at least some of the acts and omissions alleged by South Africa to have been committed by Israel in Gaza appear to be capable of falling within the provisions of the Convention. In light of the following, the court concludes that, prima facie, it has jurisdiction pursuant to Article 9 of the Convention to entertain the case. Given this conclusion, the court considers that it cannot accede to Israel's request that the case be removed from the general list. The court turns next to the question of standing of South Africa. Court notes that the respondent did not challenge the standing of the applicant in the present proceedings. In the case concerning application of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the Gambia v. Myanmar, where Article 9 of the Genocide Convention was also invoked, the court observed that all states parties to the Convention have a common interest to ensure the prevention, suppression, and punishment of genocide by committing themselves to fulfilling the obligations contained in the Convention. Such common interest implies that the obligations in question are owed by any state party to all the other state parties to the relevant convention. They are obligations erga omnes partes, in the sense that each state party has an interest in compliance with them in any given case. The common interest in compliance with the relevant obligations under the Genocide Convention entails that any state party, without distinction, is entitled to invoke the responsibility of another state party for an alleged breach of its obligations erga omnes partes. Accordingly, the court found that any state party to the Genocide Convention may invoke the responsibility of another state party, including through the institution of proceedings before the court, with a view to determining the alleged failure to comply with its obligations erga omnes partes under the Convention and to bringing a failure to the end. The court concludes prima facie that South Africa has standing to submit to it the dispute with Israel concerning alleged violations of obligations under the Genocide Convention. The court then turns to the question of the rights whose protection is sought and the link between such rights and the measures requested. It recalls that its power to indicate provisional measures under Article 41 of the statute has as its object the preservation of the respective rights claimed by the parties in a case, pending its decision on the merits thereof. It follows that the court must be concerned to preserve by such measures the rights which may subsequently be adjudged by it to belong to either party. Therefore, the court may exercise this power only if it is satisfied that the rights asserted by the party requesting such measures are at least plausible. At this stage of the proceedings, however, the court is not called upon to determine definitively whether the rights which South Africa wishes to seek protected exist. It need only decide whether the rights claimed by South Africa and for which it seeks protection are plausible. Moreover, a link must exist between the rights whose protection is sought and the provisional measures being requested. The court recalls that in accordance with Article 1 of the Convention, all states parties thereto have undertaken to prevent and to punish the crime of genocide. Article 2 provides that, I quote, "Genocide means any of the following acts committed with an intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. A, killing members of the group. B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group." End of quote. Pursuant to Article 3 of the Genocide Convention, the following acts are also prohibited by the Convention: conspiracy to commit genocide, direct and public incitement to commit genocide, attempt to commit genocide, and complicity in genocide. The provisions of the Convention are intended to protect the members of a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group from acts of genocide or any other punishable acts enumerated in Article 3. The Court considers that there is a correlation between the rights of members of groups protected under the Genocide Convention, the obligations incumbent on state parties thereto, and the right of any state party to seek compliance therewith by another state party. As the Court has stated in other cases, in order for acts to fall within the scope of Article 2 of the Convention, the intent must be to destroy at least a substantial part of a particular group. This is demanded by the very nature of the crime of genocide, since the object and purpose of the Convention as a whole is to prevent the intentional destruction of groups. The part targeted must be significant enough to have an impact on the group as a whole. The Palestinians appear to constitute a distinct national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, and hence a protected group within the meaning of Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. The Court observes that, according to United Nations sources, the Palestinian population in the Gaza Strip comprises over 2 million people. Palestinians in the Gaza Strip form a substantial part of the protected group. The Court notes that the military operation being conducted by Israel following the attack of 7 October 2023 has resulted in a large number of deaths and injuries, as well as massive destruction of homes, the forcible displacement of the vast majority of the population, and extensive damage to civilian infrastructure. While figures relating to the Gaza Strip cannot be independently verified, recent information indicates that 25,700 Palestinians have been killed, over 63,000 injuries have been reported, over 360 housing units have been destroyed or partially damaged, and approximately 1.7 million persons have been internally displaced. The Court takes note in this regard of the statement by the United Nations Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mr. Martin Griffiths, on 5 January 2024. I quote, "Gaza has become a place of death and despair. Families are sleeping in the open as temperatures plummet. Areas where civilians were told to relocate for their safety have come under bombardment. Medical facilities are under relentless attack. A public health disaster is unfolding. Gaza has simply become uninhabitable. Its people are witnessing daily threats to their very existence while the world watches on." End of quote. Following a mission to North Gaza, the World Health Organization reported that as of 21 December 2023, I quote, "An unprecedented 93% of the population of Gaza is facing crisis levels of hunger, with insufficient food and high levels of malnutrition." End of quote. The Court further notes the statement issued by the Commissioner General of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, or UNRWA, Mr. Philippe Lazzarini, on 13 January 2024. I quote, "It's been 100 days since the devastating war started, killing and displacing people in Gaza following the horrific attacks that Hamas and other groups carried out against people in Israel. It's been 100 days of ordeal and anxiety for hostages and their families. In the past 100 days, sustained bombardment across the Gaza Strip caused the massive displacement of a population that is in a state of flux, constantly uprooted and forced to leave overnight, only to move to places which are just as unsafe. This war affected more than 2 million people, the entire population of Gaza. Many will carry lifelong scars, both physical and psychological. The vast majority, including children, are deeply traumatized. Overcrowded and unsanitary UNRWA shelters have become home to more than 1.4 million people. They lack everything, from food to hygiene to privacy. People live in inhumane conditions where diseases are spreading, including among children. They live through the unlivable with the clock ticking fast towards famine. The plight of children in Gaza is especially heartbreaking. An entire generation of children is traumatized and will take years to heal. Thousands have been killed, maimed, and orphaned. Hundreds of thousands are deprived of education. Their future is in jeopardy with far-reaching and long-lasting consequences. The UNRWA Commissioner General also stated that the crisis in Gaza is, I quote, compounded by dehumanizing language, end of quote. In this regard, the court has taken note of a number of statements made by senior Israeli officials. It calls attention in particular to the following examples. On 9 October 2023, Mr. Yoav Gallant, Defense Minister of Israel, announced that he had ordered a complete siege of Gaza City, and then that there would be no electricity, no food, no fuel, and that everything was closed. On the following day, Minister Gallant stated, speaking to Israeli troops on the Gaza border, I quote, "I have released all restraints. You saw what we are fighting against. We are fighting human animals. This is the ISIS of Gaza. This is what we are fighting against. Gaza won't return to what it was before. There will be no Hamas. We will eliminate everything. If it doesn't take one day, it will take a week, it will take weeks or even months. We will reach all places." End of quote. On 12 October 2023, Mr. Isaac Herzog, President of Israel, stated, referring to Gaza, I quote, "We are working, operating militarily according to rules of international law, unequivocally. It is an entire nation out there that is responsible. It is not true, this rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved. It is absolutely not true. They could have risen up. They could have fought against that evil regime which took over Gaza in a coup d'etat. But we are at war. We are at war. We are at war. We are defending our homes. We are protecting our homes. That's the truth. And when a nation protects its home, it fights. And we will fight until we break their backbone." End of quote. On 13 October 2023, Mr. Israel Katz, then Minister of Energy and Infrastructure of Israel, stated on X, formerly Twitter, I quote, "We will fight the terrorist organization Hamas and destroy it. All the civilian population in Gaza is ordered to leave immediately. We will win. They will not receive a drop of water or a single battery until they leave the world." End of quote. The court also takes note of a press release of 16 November 2023 issued by 37 special rapporteurs, independent experts, and members of working groups part of the special procedures of the United Nations Human Rights Council, in which they voiced alarm over, I quote, "discernibly genocidal and dehumanizing rhetoric coming from senior Israeli government officials." End of quote. In addition, on 27 October 2023, the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination observed that it was highly concerned about the sharp increase in racist hate speech and dehumanization directed at Palestinians since 7 October. In the court's view, the aforementioned facts and circumstances are sufficient to conclude that at least some of the rights claimed by South Africa and for which it is seeking protection are plausible. This is the case with respect to the right of Palestinians in Gaza to be protected from acts of genocide and related prohibited acts identified in Article 3, and the right of South Africa to seek Israel's compliance with the latter's obligations under the Convention. The court then turns to the condition of the link between the plausible rights claimed by South Africa and the provisional measures requested. It considers that by their very nature, at least some of the provisional measures sought by South Africa are aimed at preserving the plausible rights it asserts on the basis of the Genocide Convention in the present case, namely, the right of the Palestinians in Gaza to be protected from acts of genocide and related prohibited acts mentioned in Article 3, and the right of South Africa to seek Israel's compliance with the latter's obligations under the Convention. Therefore, a link exists between the rights claimed by South Africa that the court has found to be plausible and at least some of the provisional measures requested. Court turns next to the question of risk of irreparable prejudice and urgency. It notes that, pursuant to Article 41 of its statute, it has the power to indicate provisional measures when irreparable prejudice could be caused to rights which are the subject of judicial proceedings, or when the alleged disregard of such rights might entail irreparable consequences. However, the power of the Court to indicate provisional measures will only be exercised if there's urgency in the sense that there is a real and imminent risk that irreparable prejudice will be caused to the rights claimed before the Court gives its final decisions. The condition of urgency is met when the acts susceptible of causing irreparable prejudice can occur at any moment before the Court makes the final decision in the case. The Court must therefore consider whether such a risk exists at this stage of the proceedings. The Court is not called upon for purposes of its decision on the request for the indication of provisional measures to establish the existence of breaches of obligations under the Genocide Convention, but to determine whether the circumstances require the indication of provisional measures for the protection of rights under that instrument. As already noted, the Court cannot at this stage make definitive findings of fact, and the right of each party to submit arguments with respect to the merits remains unaffected by the Court's decision on the request for the indication of provisional measures. The Court recalls that, as underlined in General Assembly Resolution 96-1 of 11 December 1946, I quote, "Genocide is a denial of the right of existence of entire human groups, as homicide is the denial of the right to live of individual human beings. Such denial of the right of existence shocks the conscience of mankind, results in great losses to humanity in the form of cultural and other contributions represented by these human groups, and is contrary to moral law and to the spirit and aims of the United Nations." End of quote. In view of the fundamental values sought to be protected by the Genocide Convention, the Court considers that the plausible rights in question in this proceeding, namely, the right of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip to be protected from acts of genocide and related prohibited acts identified in Article 3 of the Genocide Convention, and the right of South Africa to seek Israel's compliance with the latter's obligation under the Convention, are of such a nature that prejudice to them is capable of causing irreparable harm. During the ongoing conflict, senior United Nations officials have repeatedly called attention to the risk of further deterioration of conditions in the Gaza Strip. The Court takes note, for instance, of the letter dated 6 December 2023, whereby the Secretary General of the United Nations brought the following information to the attention of the Security Council. I quote, "The healthcare system in Gaza is collapsing. Nowhere is safe in Gaza. Amid constant bombarding by the Israel Defense Forces and without shelter or the essentials to survive, I expect public order to completely break down soon due to the desperate conditions rendering even limited humanitarian assistance impossible. An even worse situation could unfold, including epidemic diseases and increased pressure for mass displacement into neighboring countries. We are facing a severe risk of collapse of the humanitarian system. The situation is fast deteriorating into a catastrophe with potentially irreversible implications for Palestinians as a whole and for peace and security in the region. Such an outcome must be avoided at all costs." End of quote. On 5 January 2024, the Secretary General wrote again to the Security Council, providing an update on the situation in the Gaza Strip and observing that, I quote, "Sadly, devastating levels of death and destruction continue." End of quote. The Court also takes note of the 17 January 2024 statement issued by the UNRWA Commissioner General upon return from his 4th visit to the Gaza Strip since the beginning of the current conflict in Gaza. I quote, "Every time I visit Gaza, I witness how people have sunk further into despair, with the struggle for survival consuming every hour." End of quote. The Court considers that the civilian population in the Gaza Strip remains extremely vulnerable. It recalls that the military operation conducted by Israel after 7 October 2023 has resulted inter alia in tens of thousands of deaths and injuries and the destruction of homes, schools, medical facilities, and other vital infrastructure, as well as displacement on a massive scale. The court notes that the operation is ongoing and that the Prime Minister of Israel announced on 18 January 2024 that the war, I quote, will take many more long months, end of quote. At present, many Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have no access to the most basic foodstuffs, potable water, electricity, essential medicines, or heating. The World Health Organization has estimated that 15% of the women giving birth in Gaza Strip are likely to experience complications and indicates that maternal and newborn death rates are expected to increase due to the lack of access to medical care. In these circumstances, the court considers that the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip is at serious risk of deteriorating further before the court renders its final judgment. The court recalls Israel's statement that it has taken certain steps to address and alleviate the conditions faced by the population in the Gaza Strip. The court further notes that the Attorney General of Israel recently stated that a call for intentional harm to civilians may amount to a criminal offense, including that of incitement, and that several such cases are being examined by Israeli law enforcement authorities. While such steps are to be encouraged, they are insufficient to remove the risk that irreparable prejudice will be caused before the court issues its final decision in the case. In light of the foregoing, the court considers that there is urgency in the sense that there is a real and imminent risk that irreparable prejudice will be caused to the rights found by the court to be plausible before it gives its final decision. The court concludes on the basis of the aforementioned considerations that the conditions required by its statute for it to indicate provisional measures are met. It is therefore necessary, pending its final decision, for the court to indicate certain measures in order to protect the rights claimed by South Africa that the court has found to be plausible. The court recalls that it has the power under its statute, when a request for provisional measures has been made, to indicate measures that are in whole or in part other than those requested. In the present case, having considered the terms of the provisional measures requested by South Africa and the circumstances of the case, the court finds that the measures indicated need not be identical to those requested. The court considers that, with regard to the present situation, Israel must, in accordance with its obligations under the Genocide Convention, in relation to Palestinians in Gaza, take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of all acts within the scope of Article 2 of the Convention, in particular, A, killing members of the group, B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, and D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. The court recalls that these acts fall within the scope of Article 2 of the Convention when they are committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part the group as such. The court further considers that Israel must ensure with immediate effect that its military forces do not commit any of the aforementioned acts. The court is also of the view that Israel must take measures within its power to prevent and punish the direct and public incitement to commit genocide in relation to the members of the Palestinian group in the Gaza Strip. The court further considers that Israel must take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Israel must also take effective measures to prevent the destruction and ensure the preservation of evidence related to allegations of acts within the scope of Article 2 and Article 3 of the Genocide Convention against members of the Palestinian group in the Gaza Strip. Regarding the provisional measure requested by South Africa that Israel must submit a report to the court on all measures taken to give effect to the order, the court recalls that it has the power, reflected in Article 78 of the Rules of Court, to request the parties to provide information on any matter connected with the implementation of any provisional measures it has indicated. In view of the specific provisional measures it has decided to indicate, the court considers that Israel must submit a report to the court on all measures taken to give effect to this order within 1 month as from the date of this order. The report so provided shall then be communicated to South Africa, which shall be given the opportunity to submit to the court its comments thereon. The court recalls that its orders on provisional measures under Article 41 of the statute have binding effect and thus create international legal obligations for any party to whom the provisional measures are addressed. The court reaffirms that the decision given in the present proceedings in no way prejudges the question of the jurisdiction of the court to deal with the merits of the case or any questions related to the admissibility of the application or to the merits themselves. It leaves unaffected the right of the governments of the Republic of South Africa and the State of Israel to submit arguments in respect of these questions. The order then states that the court deems it necessary to emphasize that all parties to the conflict in the Gaza Strip are bound by international humanitarian law. It is gravely concerned about the fate of the hostages abducted during the attack in Israel on 7 October 2023 and held since then by Hamas and other armed groups, and calls for their immediate and unconditional release. I shall now read out the operative part of the order. For these reasons, the court indicates the following provisional measures. 1. By 15 votes to 2, the State of Israel shall, in accordance with its obligations under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in relation to the Palestinians in Gaza, take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of all acts within the scope of Article 2 of the Convention, in particular, A, killing members of the group, B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, and D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. In favor, President Donahue, Vice President Gevorgian, Judges Tomka, Abraham, Benuna, Yusuf, Shway, Bandari, Robinson, Salam, Iwasawa, Nolte, Charlesworth, Branch, Judge Ad hoc Moseneke. Against, Judge Sebatinde, Judge Ad hoc Barak. By 15 votes to 2, the State of Israel shall ensure with immediate effect that its military does not commit any acts described in point 1 above. In favor, President Donahue, Vice President Gevorgian, Judges Tomka, Abraham, Benuna, Yusuf, Shway, Bandari, Robinson, Salam, Iwasawa, Nolte, Charlesworth, Brandt, Judge Ad hoc Moseneke. Against, Judge Sebatinde, Judge Ad hoc Barak. By 16 votes to 1, the State of Israel shall take all measures within its power to prevent and punish the direct and public incitement to commit genocide in relation to members of the Palestinian group in the Gaza Strip. In favor, President Donahue, Vice President Gevorgian, Judges Tomka, Abraham, Benuna, Yusuf, Shway, Bandari, Robinson, Salam, Iwasawa, Nolte, Charlesworth, Brandt, Judges Ad hoc Barak, Moseneke. Against, Judge Sebatinde. By 16 votes to 1, the State of Israel shall take immediate and effective measures to ensure the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. In favor, President Donahue, Vice President Gevorgian, Judges Tomka, Abraham, Benuna, Youssef, Shway, Bandari, Robinson, Salam, Iwasawa, Nolte, Charlesworth, Brandt. Judges ad hoc Barak, Moseneke. Against, Judge Sabatinde. By 15 votes to 2, the State of Israel shall take effective measures to prevent the destruction and ensure the preservation of evidence related to allegations of acts within the scope of Article 2 and Article 3 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide against members of the Palestinian group in the Gaza Strip. In favor, President Donahue, Vice President Gevorgian, Judges Tomka, Abraham, Benuna, Youssef, Shway, Bandari, Robinson, Salam, Iwasawa, Nolte, Charlesworth, Brandt. Judge ad hoc Moseneke. Against, Judge Sabatinde, Judge ad hoc Barak. By 15 votes to 2, the State of Israel shall submit a report to the court on all measures taken to give effect to this order within 1 month as from the date of the order. In favor, President Donahue, Vice President Gevorgian, Judges Tomka, Abraham, Benuna, Youssef, Shway, Bandari, Robinson, Salam, Iwasawa, Nolte, Charlesworth, Brandt. Judge ad hoc Moseneke. Against, Judge Sabatinde, Judge ad hoc Barak. I shall now call upon the registrar to read the operative part of the order in French.
Par ces motifs, la Cour indique les mesures conservatoires suivantes. 1. Par 15 voix contre 2, l'État d'Israël doit, conformément aux obligations lui incombant au titre de la Convention pour la prévention et la répression du crime de génocide, prendre toutes les mesures en son pouvoir pour prévenir la commission, à l'encontre des Palestiniens de Gaza, de tout acte entrant dans le champ d'application de l'article 2 de la Convention, en particulier les actes suivants. A. Meurtre de membres du groupe. B. Atteinte grave à l'intégrité physique ou mentale de membres du groupe. C. Soumission intentionnelle du groupe à des conditions d'existence devant entraîner sa destruction physique totale ou partielle. Et D. Mesures visant à entraver les naissances au sein du groupe. Pour Madame Donoghue, présidente, Monsieur Gevorgian, vice-président, Messieurs Tomka, Abraham, Benuna, Youssouf, Madame Choué, Messieurs Bandari, Robinson, Salam, Iwasawa, Nolte, Madame Charlesworth, Monsieur Brand, juge, Monsieur Moseneke, juge ad hoc. Contre, Madame Sebutinde, juge, Monsieur Barak, juge ad hoc. 2. Par 15 voix contre 2, l'État d'Israël doit veiller avec effet immédiat à ce que son armée ne commette aucun des actes visés au point 1 ci-dessus. Pour Madame Donoghue, présidente, Monsieur Gevorgian, vice-président, Messieurs Tomka, Abraham, Benuna, Youssouf, Madame Choué, Messieurs Bandari, Robinson, Salam, Iwasawa, Nolte, Madame Charlesworth, Monsieur Brand, juge, Monsieur Moseneke, juge ad hoc. Contre, Madame Sebutinde, juge, Monsieur Barak, juge ad hoc. 3. Par 16 voix contre 1, l'État d'Israël doit prendre toutes les mesures en son pouvoir pour prévenir et punir l'incitation directe et publique à commettre le génocide à l'encontre des membres du groupe des Palestiniens.
So what you are hearing there is one of the members of the panel on the International Court of Justice reading out the court's decision in French. And until it returns to English, as you watch CBC Morning Live, I'm Heather Hiscox, joined in Geneva by Ken Roth, who is the former executive director of the Human Rights Watch, and he's been following along with me to the live coverage. As the International Court of Justice issues its interim decision, its provisional ruling on the case before it brought by South Africa alleging that Israel has committed genocidal acts in its war with Hamas, in its war in Gaza. And so the breaking news as we watch this unfold, Ken, is that indeed it has ordered Israel to take emergency preventative measures. It did not go so far as I heard, to order a ceasefire, but it has ordered a number of substantive measures an action to take and to report back in a month's time. So number one, let's just overall get your assessment of what you just heard.
Well, this was a resounding repudiation of the Israeli government's claim that there was no plausible case of genocide. Again, the court stressed this was not a finding on the merits, that will come later, but the court found that it is indeed plausible that the Israeli army is committing acts of genocide that need provisional protection while the court considers the larger case. And this was not a close decision. Most of the court's decision was by a ruling of 15-2, the two being the Israeli judge and the Ugandan judge. And indeed, the Israeli judge even joined the majority on two parts of the order. That is, the part that insists that humanitarian aid be provided, sufficient to stop the starvation, the deprivation. And second, that public incitement of genocide be stopped and punished. So this was a remarkable decision.
So let's just go through this again, because if anyone was joining us just prior to the Judge Donahue, beginning her reading, we went out very methodically. Would the court throw out the case, as Israel asked? No. It ruled it did have jurisdiction to hear the broader core question of genocide, and it did meet the threshold of plausibility, as you said, that there could be genocidal violations under the Genocide Convention that it would be looking at. So it did have area to explore here. It did have jurisdiction, and there was an urgency that there was irreparable damage potential here to the Palestinians in Gaza, which it ruled was a protected group. So for all of those reasons, then we have these emergency measures which has ordered Israel with which to comply. So number one, there was one of the things that South Africa asked was for an out-and-out immediate ceasefire to the fighting in Gaza. What the judge says the court ruled is that Israel must take all measures within its power to prevent all acts within the scope of the Genocide Convention, and that its forces do not commit any of the act in the Genocide Convention. So what is it saying there to Israel and its military?
Well, I think it's worth noting that most people did not think the court would order a ceasefire, because by the nature of the court is it resolves disputes between states. That was South Africa versus Israel. Hamas, not being a state, was not present. And so the court did not have the capacity to order Hamas to engage in a ceasefire. So it was not going to impose a ceasefire on one side. What's interesting, though, is it did go out of its way to remind Hamas that it must abide by international humanitarian law. It urged the unconditional release of the hostages. So it spoke to Hamas, but it was not able to do this as a party to the proceedings. So I think the court went as far as it could, which is to say, it ordered the Israeli military to stop acts that could further the plausible genocide that it found. It ordered that these obstacles to the delivery of humanitarian aid to starving, deprived Palestinians, that cease immediately. It ordered that genocidal statements, incitement of genocide, that stop and that be punished. So I think this is frankly as far as the court could go. I personally think most people didn't think it would go so far as ordering a full-fledged ceasefire.
Okay. Ken, as you were speaking, we were watching the panel of 17 judges exit that courtroom. We have live pictures as well outside the International Court of Justice. There are demonstrations outside the court on both sides, pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian. There is an extensive security force keeping the two sides apart. We'll be watching to see what develops here. And we do expect to hear comments from both of the legal delegations, both Israel's and South Africa's, following this ruling. So we'll be going to that live. But as I come back to you then again, Ken, for this, for analysis of what we've just heard, this key moment in the war between Israel and Hamas. This is one of the parts people were very anxious to hear, that Israel must take immediate measures to improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza. We know that very little aid has been getting in throughout the war. There was the border crossing opening at Rafah. There was Kerem Shalom, which was open, but there have been so many challenges to getting aid in. What do you think this will look like materially, this order to take immediate measures to improve humanitarian relief getting in?
Well, it's worth reiterating that this order to allow much more humanitarian aid was even endorsed by the Israeli judge. That says something. Now, this is a binding order, but as we mentioned earlier, the court can't arrest people for not following it. But this is going to put enormous pressure on the Israeli government to really change the way it's operating, not to allow just drips and drabs of humanitarian aid, not to impose these ridiculous bureaucratic obstacles on efforts to deliver aid, but really to open things up. People understand that there's a need to ensure that the aid doesn't somehow mask arms going to Hamas, but that should be done expeditiously. That should not be an obstacle to a population that is clearly suffering miserably and seems to be on the brink of large-scale starvation.
Can I just ask, I do want to ask about further implications and significance, but as you mentioned on a couple of these provisions, even the Israeli judge sided with the majority. Why would Uganda have opposed so much of this?
I don't know much about this particular judge, so I can't really say.
Okay.
President Museveni of Uganda, is himself a very problematic figure. He's leading a deeply autocratic government. He's been pursuing, vendettas against LGBT people and others. So, this judge may have been appointed by him, shares some of these sympathies. I just don't know enough about him to be able to say.
I was just curious as we watch that unfold. Okay, let's come back to what next. As you said, this is a legally binding decision, but there are no means of the International Court of Justice to enforce it. So, what do you expect to see immediately from Israel, Ken?
Well, because Israel did choose to argue this case, because it said we trust the court enough to send our lawyers there to make a 3-hour argument, it's not really in a position to say, oh, we only trust it if we win, but now that we've lost, we don't trust it. So there really is a huge moral burden on Israel to comply. I would hope that the many governments, including Canada's, that has said, we're going to abide by the court's ruling, we believe in the rule of law, I hope that they press Israel to comply. Clearly, the key actor here is the U.S. government. President Biden has enormous leverage here, $3.8 billion in annual military aid, the principal supplier of Israeli arms. He has been reluctant, he's refused so far to use that leverage. If Israel does not comply with this ruling, Biden should. He talks about supporting the rules-based order. You can't ignore the rules of the world's highest court and claim to uphold a rules-based order.
So on that point, because the United States had said the case would, the official administration word was that the case was meritless when South Africa went ahead with this. Again, as we look at live pictures from The Hague, which is the seat of government in the Netherlands, and you can see in this case the majority of pro-Palestinian protesters. There are pro-Israeli demonstrators as well, and a strong security presence to keep things peaceful as everyone absorbs this key ruling from the International Court of Justice on the matter of Israel and how it is conducting the war in Gaza. Again, coming back to the United States, so initially said meritless, and yesterday was asked, as some of the official administration officials were asked about whether or not the U.S. would comply or how the U.S. would react to whatever the court decided and wouldn't tip its hand. But I'm wondering what you think the U.S. response will be, because the president of that court was in fact American, and she was part of the majority decisions in all of these provisions. So will there be, do you think, any discussion of pulling back any of the military aid at all, Ken?
Well, I think it's important to stress, first of all, that Joan Donoghue, the president, was there as an individual, as a respected jurist. She was not representing the U.S. government. But the fact that she endorsed this, the fact that parts of the order the Israeli judge endorsed, that says something. So I would hope that the Biden administration really ratchets up the pressure on Netanyahu. Now, I don't anticipate that immediately that's going to lead to a cessation of aid, a cessation of arms sales, but it is time to put that on the table. If Netanyahu continues to resist, continues to pummel Palestinians from the air, and continues to deprive Palestinians of basic necessities of life, the medical care, the food, the water, that was eloquently described by the court itself.
What do you think this will mean for the Palestinian people in Gaza, Ken?
I think this offers them some hope. There is this sense that, the West was somehow ignoring them, that the West would talk about Ukrainians being pummeled by Russia or Uyghurs being imprisoned by China. But when it came to Palestinian suffering at the hands of Israelis, the West just sort of shrugged its shoulders. And, this is now a global statement. I would hope that Western governments stand behind this statement. It would really be, I think, awful if somehow they made an exception to the rule of law just because it's Israel. So I hope that this is an opportunity for the West to really show that it expects Israel to change, and that, for the time being at least, should be a real source of hope for Palestinian civilians who have very little to be hopeful about in the state.
I'm going to bring in later this morning some reporting from Israel itself, but I'm interested in your perspective on how this might be met in the country. Of course, the Genocide Convention from 1948, the world's response to the most notorious genocide in history, the Nazi Holocaust, and the country was established in the wake of that genocide. How do you think within the country people will react to this?
I expect there's going to be shock because the defense that we heard from the Israeli lawyers is a pretty prevalent view, which is to say, we, Israel, are defending ourselves. Hamas attacked us. There was this horrible attack of October 7th. We're just defending ourselves. Hamas speaks in genocidal terms about Israel. How could we be committing genocide? And this ruling, it's not a definitive repudiation of that because it's not a ruling on the merits, but it certainly is a provisional repudiation of that. It provisionally is saying it doesn't matter what Hamas did. It doesn't matter what Hamas said. You still have to respond lawfully. And the court is finding that plausibly Israel is not responding lawfully, that it needs to re-examine this self-defense. It's not enough to just say self-defense over and over. You really have to look how that defense is being carried out. And the court has ordered some pretty important changes in the way that defense is pursued.
Kenneth Roth is a visiting professor at Princeton School for Public and International Affairs. He is the former executive director of Human Rights Watch. It has been my great privilege to have you with me this morning as we've watched this unfold, this historic moment, and helping us understand it better. Thank you very much for your expertise this morning. I've appreciated it. You are watching special in-depth coverage as we continue to follow the war between Israel and Hamas. And these are live images here on CBC News Network and CBC Morning Live from outside the World Court in The Hague. The justices, the 17 judges on that World Court panel, have just issued their preliminary ruling in the genocide case that South Africa brought to the court, the top world court for the United Nations. South Africa asked for the International Court of Justice to issue an order calling for Israel to halt its offensive into Gaza. The judges are stopping short of that, but the court is ordering Israel to take a number of steps to protect the Palestinian people under the Genocide Convention of 1948. If you're just joining us now, you missed part of the ruling being read out in court. Here is the president of the International Court of Justice as she read out the court orders.
For these reasons, the court indicates the following provisional measures. 1. By 15 votes to 2, the State of Israel shall, in accordance with its obligations under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in relation to the Palestinians in Gaza, take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of all acts within the scope of Article 2 of the Convention, in particular, A, killing members of the group, B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, and D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group.
Let's go now to our senior correspondent, Chris Brown, and he has been listening in. He is in Jerusalem, so an important part of the story, obviously, in all of this. Chris, good to see you and for giving us some time. There is a lot to process in all of this. It is a key moment in the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas. As you listen to the International Court of Justice, what are the key points that you want to point out for us that we should be paying attention to?
Well, I think what's very key is going into this, Israel had said that this case that South Africa had brought was baseless. The United States had also said it was without merit. And the court has not ruled with them. They've in fact said there may indeed be merit, that some of what Israel has done in Gaza could possibly have broken the Genocide Convention. Now, they're saying that without prejudice in the sense that this case is going to go on for a very long time, possibly years, but at least on the very surface, they're almost like saying, look, you've established a prima facie case that you were correct to bring this, and there's at least something worthy here to look at. So I think at the very beginning, the Israeli government has lost that because, as I said, they wanted it thrown out. But on the other hand, as you just said, really South Africa didn't get the key thing that it was asking for, and that was a suspension of the military campaign in Gaza. That perhaps is not so much of a surprise. They asked for 9 different provisional measures, and some of the other ones were granted. And just going through them, they have to take measures to improve the humanitarian situation. Well, Israel brought before the court evidence to show that it said shows that it was trying to improve the humanitarian situation, that it was allowing many hundreds of truckloads of aid going into Gaza. But in effect, the court is saying, well, you have to do more. You have to do more than that as well. It also said you have to preserve any evidence that might suggest that genocide happened. You have to keep records of it, and we're going to check up on you every month to make sure that you're doing that as well. And then they also suggested that you have to punish anyone who makes, let's say, genocidal remarks or incites people to genocide. And I think this is a very important point because in its ruling, the court pointed out some of the statements made not just by ordinary Israelis, but by the very most senior members of Israel's cabinet. Yoav Gallant, for example, the court cited his statement way back in October as saying, when they began the invasion of Gaza, I have released all restraints. We are fighting human animals, he was quoted as saying. So the court invoked a number of these statements from senior Israeli ministers. So again, even though the South Africans did not get everything they wanted, much of this, I think, will be very embarrassing for the Israelis.
So again, coming back to this, just to be clear, we've been restating this through the morning, Chris. This is not the ultimate finding on the core question of is Israel committing genocidal acts in Gaza. This is this provisional interim ruling, sort of a restraining order, if we can put it that way, or an injunction to get Israel to react, to stop the way it is handling the fighting in Gaza, not explicitly ordering a ceasefire, but measures to prevent and punish that direct incitement that you mentioned. So, Chris, as you're there, I'm just curious, yesterday there was a meeting. Benjamin Netanyahu held a meeting, the Prime Minister, at the Curia to prepare for any possible scenario. They declassified comments yesterday to show Israel has taken steps to protect civilian lives. The Attorney General in Israel just yesterday indicated she was going to investigate certain statements, those you just referred to, Chris, that might qualify as incitement. But the court ruled this morning that those measures were insufficient. So what do you think you're going to see from Israel right away, immediately in the short term?
So the cabinet's going to have to make a decision. This is a legally binding ruling from the UN's highest court, but it is not in practice enforceable. No one can make Israel do it. So Israel's going to have to decide, are we going to go along with this ruling or are we going to reject it as well? And it's also going to be very important for the United States and other countries that have been supporting Israel to also make that decision. Countries such as Canada have been very quick when this very same court have made rulings, interim measures against other countries accused of genocide. Myanmar comes to mind. So how will the rest of the world react to this? Will this ruling be sent up to the UN Security Council? Will this try to be passed into law that way? And will countries such as the United States and Britain have to use their veto in order to decide if this goes through? So there's a lot of diplomatic fallout from this, and a lot of significant decisions have to be made. We're just getting some very early reaction, Heather, from Palestinian side. I'm just reading a release from the Palestinian Authority not far from here in Ramallah. And they are welcoming the provisional measures ordered by the court. The President al-Maliki said that all states should ensure that these measures are implemented, including by Israel. So again, as I say, a lot of focus now will be on Israel supporters to try to ensure that this ruling has some teeth.
Chris, one more in terms of reaction from Israel's national security minister, who's part of the coalition government on the right wing of things, on X, so on social media. This is what he tweeted. His reaction: hag schmag, which lets you think that some of the members within the Netanyahu cabinet are I don't know what that cabinet meeting, how it will go, but there will be some very strong opposition to taking the action that the International Court of Justice has just issued. So not explicitly a ceasefire, but again, measures to refrain from any acts that could fall under the Genocide Convention, ensure that troops do not commit any genocidal acts, also improve the humanitarian situation. So today, Chris, what will you be reporting on? What specifically will you be looking for as far as next steps?
I think we should really keep an eye on these discussions going on between the United States, Qatar, and Israel involving a potential hostage deal with Hamas. We understand that the head of the CIA, William Burns, is going to be flying in this direction to Europe and to the Middle East to try to personally broker and get this done. Benjamin Netanyahu is under an immense amount of domestic pressure here now to try to free these remaining hostages. The exact number is not known. Possibly just over 100, but there's also some bodies of some hostages that have either died or have been killed. So we're going to be watching that because along with any possible hostage deal, there could come some kind of a pause, not using the word ceasefire, but some kind of a pause in the fighting. And how long will this be? There's been some suggestions it could be 2 months, some suggestions it could be 3 months, but it's going to be very, very interesting over the next number of days to see just how gelled up this goes. Hamas is asking for the release of all the prisoners, all the detainees that are now in Israeli jails. Those number in the thousands. So a ton of moving parts here, Heather.
Chris, thank you very much for helping us look ahead to that and also assess things. And as I bring you some more of the reaction, Chris Brown will be part of our CBC News team covering this from Jerusalem. Reaction from South Africa that South Africa will continue to act within institutions of global government and governance to protect the rights of Palestinians. And here's another comment from the government of South Africa that South Africa sincerely hopes Israel will not act to frustrate the application of this order. As I mentioned, the National Security Minister, as part of the Netanyahu government, on social media responded, hag schmag. So we will see what happens there. I want to share with you, if you weren't listening to the full readout from the President of the Court of Justice in her preamble before issuing the ruling, the President spoke to the humanitarian crisis inside Gaza since October the 7th. She cited unverified numbers that Hamas has reported, those numbers we bring you daily from the Gaza Health Ministry, which is controlled by Hamas, but also several high-level international observers who have visited Gaza during this war.
The court notes that the military operation being conducted by Israel following the attack of 7 October 2023 has resulted in a large number of deaths and injuries, as well as massive destruction of homes, the forcible displacement of the vast majority of the population, and extensive damage to civilian infrastructure. While figures relating to the Gaza Strip cannot be independently verified, recent information indicates that 25,700 Palestinians have been killed. Over 63,000 injuries have been reported. Over 360 housing units have been destroyed or partially damaged. And approximately 1.7 million persons have been internally displaced. The court takes note in this regard.
We're just going to leave that reading out from earlier this morning and take you right to the steps of the International Court of Justice. This is South Africa's response to the ICJ decision.
Omar, yeah, I'm sure you know him. So the minister is going to speak, and then Omar is going to speak as well. Gigi will take questions. You all ready? Yes. Good to go. Minister, over to you.
My name is Naledi Pandor, and I'm the South African Minister of International Relations and Cooperation. I wish to begin by thanking the judges of the International Court of Justice for dealing with this matter expeditiously. Given the urgency of the need to protect innocent civilians in Palestine, and to ensure that the harm that South Africa has referred to in the case it brought before the ICJ, that harm is addressed and that people's lives are saved. The saving of life is not merely with respect to having a ceasefire, it's to ensuring that humanitarian aid is provided to those who need support, as well as ensuring that the State of Israel, which is currently the occupier and administrator in Palestine, provides the necessary basic services that the residents of Gaza and the West Bank require. This case was very much about international bodies ensuring that they exercise their responsibility to protect us all as global citizens. All member states of the United Nations have attached their signatures to a range of instruments. But when lives are threatened, these instruments are not brought to bear. And South Africa had the view that we could not stand idly by and continue to observe the killing of thousands of Palestinian citizens who had no role in the awful act of hostage-taking and killing that was done by Hamas. And therefore, we thought it important that we do report and apply to the International Court of Justice, provided within the Convention for the Punishment and Prevention of Genocide, are brought to bear, and that the State of Israel is called upon by the judges to act to protect civilians and to end the massive level of harm that we have seen since the Israeli action began. And we agree entirely with the judges that Hamas should release the hostages that they're currently holding. We also, in our various engagements with our partners internationally, believe the moment is now ripe for there to be negotiations for a two-state solution to end this conflict decisively.
Minister, are you disappointed there isn't a ceasefire? Are you disappointed the court?
I believe that in exercising the order, there would have to be a ceasefire. Without it, the order doesn't actually work. I would have wanted a ceasefire. No, they didn't.
Are you disappointed
but how,
they didn't specify that?
I have no way that I'm going to say I'm disappointed. I hoped for it, but the fact of delivering humanitarian aid, the fact of taking measures that reduce the levels of harm against persons who have no role in what Israel is combating, for me requires a ceasefire. And I believe Israel would have to attend to how it conducts its search for the hostages and for those Hamas individuals who carried out the October 7 attack.
What's the next step?
I believe that the court judgment needs to be read very, very carefully. They've given very, very direct instructions. We are satisfied that the provisional measures that we sought to be addressed would be addressed by the court. And I believe if you read the convention very carefully, the matter of how a war or conflict is conducted is not elaborated. I would have wanted that the word cessation is included in the judgment. But I'm satisfied with the directives that have been given. And in particular, I was concerned as the president of the court was reading the order that reference wasn't being made to a report, because the reporting is absolutely imperative. The monitoring of action in terms of the order is vital. And so for the fact that a monthly report, a report within 1 month of this date, has been ordered is, I believe, very significant.
What do you say to Germany and the United States who have called this case meritless?
Well, the fact that the court says, remember that today we're not deciding about the allegation of genocide. What we're dealing with are the provisional measures. it's clear that the court does say circumstances exist where it is plausible that genocidal acts have been committed. This, of course, means once the merit case is addressed, and if the finding is that there has been genocide, those states that have aided and abetted become a party to commission of an infringement in terms of the convention.
Do you think Israel will conform to the orders laid down by the court today?
I've never really been hopeful about Israel, but Israel has very powerful friends who I hope will advise Israel that they should act in terms of the order.
Would you say, what does it say about Israel as a country and a government and a military?
I think that's for you and the public to decide. What we've said is, here's an international instrument, let us bring it into operation, and let's stop being observers of significant harm. Let's act, and South Africa has acted. And what the court has actually indicated is that this convention is being brought to life in a very practical way. And I now think what we want is that the member states of the United Nations must oversee the process and ensure that we create a basis for a global community in which a resort to arms is no longer easy. A resort to abuse is no longer easy, and that more effort is now directed toward negotiation and toward seeking peaceful means of ending conflict.
And do you think Hamas behaved genocidally?
Well, as far as I understand the convention, states are members, states are signatories, and you bring actions with reference to states, not to particular groups.
But has Hamas behaved genocidally?
Well, I believe that what has been done by Hamas is certainly caused great harm, and I do think that the hostages should be freed, and that's what we must focus upon.
Madam Minister, okay, do you believe that the decision of the court will help, let's say, in solving the problem of the Israeli aggression against the Palestinians today, and in the short term maybe can help finding a political solution to the conflict between the Palestinian people and the Israeli occupation?
Well, my hope is that we will begin to move toward a process where substantively a two-state solution is being discussed. The people of Palestine have suffered harm for many, many decades. I don't believe it will end today or tomorrow. But what we've done is a very clear signal has been sent by the court. And it's now a test for the government and people of Israel as to whether they will act in a manner that says all of us must respect international law.
And what are the implications for international law?
Hello.
Well, if Israel acts in accord with it, I think the implications are for a future hopeful world. Should it not, then essentially we are opening up room for all abusers in many conflicts throughout the world. And I think we'll be setting a terrible, terrible precedent. So what we should do, what all of us should do, is call on Israel to act in terms of the decisions.
Will you sever ties with Israel, or are you preserving ties with Israel?
I don't think it's a matter of South Africa and Israel here. The real issue, all your questions are about Israel, but the real issue is the people of Palestine who are being killed every day. The people of Palestine who are sleeping in the cold. The people of Palestine who are denied food, water, and energy. That is the critical issue that all of us should focus upon.
Yeah. And on that note, we're going to ask the Vice Foreign Minister of...
That with the people of Palestine, we stand with the people of Palestine, and our message to them is never give up hope. South Africa got over the apartheid oppression. They will overcome.
And for that, we'll ever be grateful, Your Excellency.
Thank you.
Allow me to start by saying that we concur with everything that Her Excellency, the Minister of International Cooperation of South Africa, Naledi Pandor, has stated in front of all of you, and to read a message from the Palestinian people on this very important day. This is a historic day. Palestine welcomes the momentous order by the International Court of Justice. This order means that the court recognized the gravity of the situation and was convinced by South Africa's compelling presentation that was based on law and fact, that there are plausible cause to believe that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. It means that the cries and suffering of our people in Gaza have been heard in the Great Hall of Justice. Israel failed. It failed to convince the court to dismiss the complaint to prove that it is not deliberately violating Genocide Convention. The ICJ judges assessed the facts and the law and issued their order. Israel now will stand trial accused of committing the crime of all crimes. We call on states to ensure that all provisional measures ordered by the court are implemented. States and governments have clear obligations in light of this order. First and foremost, they must make sure they are not complicit in this genocide. This is a good day for humanity. This ruling is in favor of international system based on law and against exceptionalism and double standards. It should be a wake-up call for Israel and its enablers. The State of Palestine will undertake every endeavor to follow up on this important ruling by the courts towards ensuring the rights of the Palestinian people and ensuring justice. To this end, and with deep conviction in the rule of law, we will continue pursuing accountability and justice in all forms, including in the few weeks' time when we return here to the ICJ on the 19th of February for the oral hearings in the advisory opinion proceedings on Israel's illegal occupation and regime inside the occupied Palestinian territory. This illegal occupation and apartheid regime must be brought to an end. Palestine will forever be grateful to South Africa for taking this bold step of active solidarity. Together with peace-loving nations, we will continue to work to stop genocide, hold perpetrators to account, and work to stop all other atrocities against our people. Just few words in Arabic, and I'll conclude my statement and open the way for questions and answers. هذا يوم تاريخي.
So you're listening in to the reaction from the South African delegation, the African National Congress, the international minister speaking there to say the Genocide Convention has been brought to life to celebrate the International Court of Justice's decision not to order an out-and-out ceasefire, but to tell Israel that it must change the way it is fighting the war in Gaza, that it must make sure that in no way do its military, do its soldiers commit acts that could be under the Genocide Convention, to urge more humanitarian aid into the region, and in fact to report back in a month's time to give an account for itself as to what has changed. I want to bring in just for a few minutes, because that's all the time she has, and I do want to hear her voice very clearly, Arwa Damon, who's been with us throughout the war, foreign correspondent of note, and also now working very closely in the area of humanitarian assistance. She's in Istanbul today. Arwa, welcome back. You were listening in as some of the reaction from South Africa came in. Overall, what is the message the International Court of Justice has sent today to Israel?
I mean, to a certain degree, look, it's telling Israel very clearly that the world is watching and that this case is most certainly going to be ongoing. It's not over yet. However, if we really look at this from the Palestinian perspective, to a certain degree, especially for those that are living in Gaza, this is a tough moment because so many there had really been hoping that this was somehow going to lead to a ceasefire because, simply put, they cannot take it anymore. The conditions inside the Strip are beyond abysmal. Everybody is hungry. So many children have diarrhea and other respiratory illnesses and communicable diseases. Something like almost 100% of all wounds are infected. Aid has yet to reach the north. So perhaps if we actually do see Israel allowing more aid in, as is being called for, taking more measures to protect the civilian population, as this ruling is calling for, keeping in mind, though, that Israel has been called on numerous times in the past to take measures to protect the civilian population and quite simply has not. perhaps we could see a little bit of the easing of the suffering of the civilian population. But really, if you think about those families, the children, the mothers who are inside right now, who are really just hoping for a break, hoping for this to end, this is going to be really hard.
Arwa, I want to talk to you about how aid could flow in, some of the practical things that could happen to make it better, to improve the conditions in life for the people in Gaza right now. But you've raised Israel, how it will respond, as you said. This is a legally binding decision, no right to appeal, but there are no means to enforce what the ICJ has just ruled. And we've heard from Benjamin Netanyahu just recently that no one will stop us, not The Hague, not the axis of evil, and no one else. So the question of will Israel accept the court's decision is in the air. And he has just, Arwa, released something on social media in terms of Israel's response. Can you listen to it with me? We'll listen to it for the first time together, and then I'll get your perspective on this. So here is Benjamin Netanyahu as he just posted.
Israel's commitment to international law is unwavering. Equally unwavering is our sacred commitment to continue to defend our country and defend our people. Like every country, Israel has an inherent right to defend itself. The vile attempt to deny Israel this fundamental right is blatant discrimination against the Jewish state, and it was justly rejected. The charge of genocide leveled against Israel is not only false, it's outrageous, and decent people everywhere should reject it. On the eve of the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, I again pledge as Israel's Prime Minister, never again. Israel will continue to defend itself against Hamas, a genocidal terror organization. On October 7th, Hamas perpetrated the most horrific atrocities against the Jewish people since the Holocaust, and it vows to repeat these atrocities again and again and again. Our war is against Hamas terrorists, not against Palestinian civilians. We will continue to facilitate humanitarian assistance and to do our utmost to keep civilians out of harm's way, even as Hamas uses civilians as human shields. We will continue to do what is necessary to defend our country and defend our people.
That is Benjamin Netanyahu, as he's just posted on social media his response to the International Court of Justice decision. It's interesting, the court specifically said, yes, Israel has taken measures, but they are insufficient. Arwa Damon, war correspondent, long time covering the region. As you listen in, some of the words, the core question brought by South Africa on genocide is not just false but outrageous. But he did reiterate that Israel will continue to defend itself against Hamas. So how do you think then we will see Israel respond here?
Well, if we take Netanyahu's words at face value, we can assume that we're going to see more of the same, because that's exactly the same rhetoric that he and other government officials have been putting out there from the very beginning, that Israel has a right to defend itself, that it is protecting the civilian population, that it is allowing humanitarian aid to go through. But, you know, there's that age-old expression of actions speak louder than words, and a campaign to go after a terrorist organization or an armed militant group that has protection of civilians as its focus does not end up in a death toll of over 26,000, with 70% of them being women and children. When we talk about a flow of humanitarian aid, that means that sufficient humanitarian aid is allowed inside Gaza. To date, we have under 10,000 trucks that have been allowed in. To give you an idea of what that means, that's just over 100 a day. The Strip needs, during normal times, 500 trucks to cross through. So obviously, not enough humanitarian aid is getting in. Add to all of that, when it comes to the aid that is getting in, deconfliction, which is what is meant to be happening, is not taking place. It's not working. What does deconfliction actually mean? So it's basically the process of coordinating between humanitarian entities and a military to be able to identify safe zones where aid can be distributed to the civilian population, and also to help facilitate transporting aid from one location to another safely. These measures don't work. And as of now, the vast majority of requests, for example, to get humanitarian aid to the north of Gaza, where the situation is extraordinarily dire, well, none of those have actually been approved. One last point to make, just as an example, only around 25% of medical missions that have requested access to Gaza have been granted it. Only 25%.
So, Arwa, again, coming back to this point of Israel will continue to defend itself against Hamas. We heard from the South African minister just before going to you as she was reacting live, questioned about whether Israel would conform with the ICJ decision. And she said she wasn't optimistic about Israel's response, but she did say that Israel has powerful friends who will and could advise Israel to comply. What kind of pressure do you see this decision putting on allies like the U.S., notably, the U.K., other countries? What do you think might happen in terms of pressure on Israel now?
I mean, I think, look, it's definitely going to put a little bit more pressure on Israel's Western allies, but is it going to be putting enough pressure on Israel's Western allies? Look, this decision, even if the court had issued a ruling for a ceasefire to take place as one of these sort of provisional interim steps, Israel could have easily chosen, or probably would have chosen, not to comply, in which case it would have gone to the UN Security Council, and there you obviously always have the U.S. veto. America really right now is the place, I think, to be looking towards. What is the U.S. willing to do to try to force Israel to comply? And will it take a measure that would be considered drastic by many, but would it take a measure such as cutting off military assistance to Israel? This is something actually that a group of aid organizations and human rights organizations have been calling for. They have been saying to Israel's allies, look, if you do not want to call for a ceasefire, at least turn off the tap, stop arming the Israelis and facilitating this. But right now, really, it's going to be quite interesting to see how the Biden White House does end up reacting, especially taking into consideration that President Biden himself has on numerous occasions said that, you know, international law needs to be applied everywhere. But of course, again, it goes back to rhetoric is one thing when it comes to a lot of these diplomats and a lot of these governments, and actions are something else.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Africa. I'm watching for any reaction from him, or as you say, from the Biden administration. We'll get some reporting out of Washington on that very point to come a little bit later on in our special coverage. But let me ask you, Arwa, just in conclusion, if there is, and there is indeed, one of the emergency measures the International Court of Justice has just ordered is an improved flow of humanitarian relief aid into Gaza. Right now, you and I have talked about Rafah, the one main entry point, and then the Kerem Shalom secondary point. How would you see things unfolding? What would be the tangible steps to take to allow more aid in? What would they have to do?
Well, look, there's a number of obstacles to aid actually getting into Gaza and then moving around Gaza. First and foremost, Rafah, which is where the majority of the aid goes through, was never meant to be a commercial crossing. In theory, you would actually try to move all aid shipments into Gaza from Egypt and have them go through Israel, which is what was taking place before October 7th. There is a significantly better infrastructure at Kerem Shalom to be able to scan all of these trucks and move them into the Gaza Strip. You would also need to be able to better facilitate the movement of staff for humanitarian organizations. All humanitarian organizations need to be able to scale up the number of staff that they have inside the Gaza Strip. And lastly, we would need to actually see the deconfliction that I was talking about earlier being put to a much bigger and stronger effect. The deconfliction zones need to be able to function and operate. Add to all of that, you would also need communications to be turned back on. It's impossible to deliver aid when you can't communicate with your logistics supply chain, when you can't communicate with your drivers. You would also need to see a number of other steps taking place. But Israel also has a pretty quick option if it wants to really say to the world, hey, I'm going to comply by this. I'm going to ease this a little bit. Israel can very easily choose to turn the water and the electricity back on.
Arwa, thank you very much. I always appreciate your perspective when you join us, and especially this morning. Arwa Damon, longtime foreign war correspondent from Istanbul this morning. And as you join us, it is just about 20 to 9 Eastern Time. I'm Heather Hiscox, and you're watching CBC Morning Live. We've had special coverage all morning of the International Court of Justice, the top court for the United Nations in The Hague, which hears and decides on disputes between states, hearing the South African case against Israel, alleging that there are genocidal acts in its war against Hamas in Gaza. And the court has ruled that, in fact, Israel must try to limit the deaths and damage that the war is causing in Gaza. You're looking here at pictures just outside the court. This is just as the decision was coming down in the 7 o'clock Eastern hour. There are huge crowds of demonstrators, both pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli. And the decision from the court we were waiting for, would it find that it had jurisdiction? It did. Would it find that there had been the threshold met, that it was plausible? This is not the core question of whether Israel is committing acts of genocide. Is it plausible that what is happening in Gaza is inconsistent with the Genocide Convention? And indeed, it reached that threshold, that it is plausible that the death and destruction could be reaching that threshold, and that gave the court the power to bring in emergency measures to answer the urgency of the situation for the people of Gaza, urgency to respond with a series of orders to Israel. As I mentioned, didn't go as far as ordering a ceasefire, but it did order Israel to limit the deaths and damage that its military offensive is causing. As we were talking with Arwa, it said Israel must allow more humanitarian aid in, and it said Israel must report back to court within a month to give the court an update on the changes and what has been happening as a result of that rebuke. Let's bring in Dominic Velitis, because he's been with me all morning, too, as we've listened to this. In terms of reaction, Dominic, we just heard from Benjamin Netanyahu himself, and that is key. But as we were looking outside that court, we heard first from the South African legal contingent. What kinds of reaction are you wanting to highlight this morning?
Well, the reaction is coming in thick and fast now to the ICJ's ruling today. The first to do so, the first to react, was the Palestinian Foreign Minister Riyad al-Maliki. Now, earlier he gave a televised speech in which he said the ICJ judges assessed the facts and the law. They ruled in favour of humanity and international law. And Heather, he went on to add that Palestine calls on all states to ensure the measures ordered by the court are implemented, including, he said, by Israel, which he went on to describe as the occupying power. As you say, we've also heard from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. In a statement, he has said that Israel's commitment to international law is unwavering. Equally unwavering is our sacred commitment to continue to defend our country and defend our people. Like every country, he says, Israel has an inherent right to defend itself. And he goes on to say, Heather, the vile attempt to deny Israel this fundamental right is blatant discrimination against the Jewish state, and it was justly rejected. One other for you, Heather. We've also heard from the South African government, which, of course, brought this case to the court. It has welcomed the provisional measures that the ICJ has ordered. In a short statement earlier, it said, today marks a decisive victory for international rule of law and a significant milestone in search for justice for Palestinian people. And Heather, not long after that statement was released, we did hear from Naledi Pandor, who is the South African Minister of International Relations. She spoke on the steps of The Hague. Here's a little more of what she had to say.
The saving of life is not merely with respect to having a ceasefire, it's to ensuring that humanitarian aid is provided to those who need support, as well as ensuring that the state of Israel, which is currently the occupier and administrator in Palestine, provides the necessary basic services that the residents of Gaza and the West Bank require.
That was Naledi Pandor there, the South Africa Minister of International Relations, speaking on the steps of The Hague a short while ago, Heather. One final bit of reaction for you. We have heard from an unnamed senior official with Hamas. He has been speaking to Reuters, and in a statement he has said that the ICJ decision is an important development that contributes to isolating the occupation, as he put it, and exposing its crimes in Gaza. Heather.
Dominic Velitis from London with reaction, and we will continue to gather further reaction from world leaders. And we're waiting for the Canadian government reaction to all of this. Let's bring in Janice McGregor. Janice is in Ottawa. She's been following in with what's been happening this morning. Just, Janice, to set you up. Again, I come back to the remark we heard from South Africa's Interior Minister that there are powerful friends who can urge, who can advise Israel to comply. The U.S., Canada potentially. We know that Canada has said it will, it respects the works of this court, that it will abide by the decision. What is the government's position likely to be on what we've heard today?
You've narrowed in on exactly kind of the main question for Canadian politicians and even stakeholder groups and other civil society leaders in Ottawa today. This court has now made its sort of view clear. It come out with some provisional measures. So what are you going to do about it, Canada? What are you going to do about it, other countries who are also signatories to the Genocide Convention, who have also said that they believe in these international institutions, that they want to uphold multilateralism, international law. So what are you going to do about it? How are you going to use your standing with the Israeli government to ensure that what this court has asked for is upheld? You are going to hear that question again and again and again today, Heather. We are waiting for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to arrive on Parliament Hill. The Liberal National Caucus is meeting this morning. We don't know who's going to stop on their way in. Of course, always their prerogative, whether they take our questions or not. I can tell you our colleagues are there and prepared to ask them. The Prime Minister yesterday, in his comments to the National Caucus, more or less stayed to sort of what we have heard from the Liberals to this point, talking about how, in his view, it is the great strength of the Liberal Party and the caucus that he was speaking to, that there are a diversity of views inside that kind of Liberal family, if you will. Of course, we know there have been Liberal MPs who have gone to Israel, who have spoken out about Israel's right to defend itself, who have spoken out about their fears of anti-Semitism in this moment. We also know there are people in this caucus who made a trip, visited the West Bank, spoke out strongly against occupation there, spoke out very concerned about the fate of the civilian population in Gaza, and have called loudly for whether it has been phrased as humanitarian pause or whether it in effect meant calling for a ceasefire. And there's been a whole lot of both semantic and practical arguments around that, but have advocated very strongly for Canada to demand more on the world stage on that front. And the Prime Minister has had to straddle this, balance this in his own Liberal family, but also in Canadian society at large, try to keep any violence and strong feelings, from erupting, but nevertheless has not taken an equivocal stand on to what lengths Canada would go to uphold this decision or put pressure on Israel, even cut ties with Israel if need be. I do see some cars rolling up, so bear with me if I suddenly stop talking so we can listen to the Prime Minister. But I want to tell you, on his itinerary, just in terms of what you might call stakeholder management today, he is going to a Holocaust remembrance event at 11 o'clock today, as well as this caucus meeting. So I think the message on that is clear. Here comes the Prime Minister, though, up the stairs.
And there goes the Prime Minister, Janice. So let's just watch here. Okay, so sometimes on days of caucus meetings, cabinet meetings, he walks by and then comes back later and does address reporters. So we will see. There's Rafi Boudjikanian who's there. So we'll see if that is the case. And one would imagine that there will be some, I mean, they would have anticipated a response, but it'll take some time to make sure. There's been many accusations of mismanagement over the position and confusion in terms of Canada's position. Does it support Israel's or South Africa's position before the ICJ? So many people hoping for some clarity here in responding to what the ICJ has issued today, Janice.
That's right. This sense that you can't kind of kick the can forever on taking a meaningful position on this, right? Like for a while, you can use the talking point of we need to hear from the court. We need to let this process play out. Today, we have heard from the court. We now have this list of provisional measures. We know sort of what the court has done, not called for a total ceasefire, but has specifically asked Israel to course correct in a number of very concrete respects in terms of the IDF operation and humanitarian aid insofar as you've been discussing. So again, for politicians around the world, including Canada's, what are you going to do to uphold these provisional measures from the International Court of Justice? This is probably the challenge for government communicators today, to figure out how they're going to position this, and how hard, frankly, to be diplomatically with Israel at a time when you don't necessarily want to send a message that you're not continuing to stand with Israel in a world where we do know there is a lot of anti-Semitism sometimes driving international perspectives. But as I said, again, this event the Prime Minister is attending at 11 o'clock for Holocaust Remembrance, I think the message politically in that is clear. That will be a message to Canada's Jewish diaspora, for example. But also we know that we are expecting, as the day goes on in Ottawa, to be calls from diplomats, stakeholder groups, for Canada to take concrete steps now, whether it is cutting ties with Israel's military, taking action to take Canada's Defence Ministry, make sure it's no longer supplying the IDF with weapons material support that it could be using against civilians, for example, to look at things like charitable status for certain groups if they are seen to somehow be aiding and abetting the activities that the ICJ is now coming out, and speaking out about with these provisional measures. This is living on two levels. You have your bigger principle: is it a genocide or not? We don't have the final answer on that. It's ceasefire or not. We do have in these provisional measures, well short of an explicit call for that. It is not a message that Israel can't defend itself, can't go after Hamas, but the how of that, the practical measures, what would Canada do there? And I think as we listen today, that's what we've got to be sort of pulling apart.
Janice, thank you for all of that. We will be back to you. We're watching as well, as we mentioned, the hallway in Ottawa as the Liberal caucus members arrive at their session. The House returns next week, so we have access to a number of politicians as they prepare for that resumption of activity next week. Again, as Janice was mentioning, the actual decision from the International Court of Justice. Let's just go back again. Let's take you to The Hague. Some pictures here. You can see the large crowds as they awaited this much-anticipated decision. South Africa filed this first at the end of December. In mid-January, the court heard 2 days of hearings, first from South Africa and then from Israel. The allegation from South Africa is that Israel has committed genocidal acts in its war against Hamas in the war in Gaza. The large question of whether this does meet the threshold from genocide, that has not been decided today. We have to be very clear on that. This is not the broad question of genocide. But in the interim, South Africa asked the court to find that it had jurisdiction and there was urgency and it met the threshold of plausibility that it could bring in these provisional measures, emergency measures, to try to limit the loss of life and destruction in Gaza. And that is exactly what the court has done today. It has not gone so far, as Janice was saying, to order a ceasefire, but it has ordered 6 provisional measures against Israel, among them to get the military to ensure it is complying with the Genocide Convention in how it fights the war, to make sure that it is not causing harm to people in Gaza, that it urgently needs to get aid to people in Gaza, that Israel should prevent and punish any incitement that might be seen to be genocidal intent. So the comments, the statements, those are very important as well, and to report back to the court in a month's time. And it's interesting, many of these measures were met by very large majorities. Israel itself agreed with 2 of them in the vote, and the 17-member panel that made these decisions today. We're going to get some reaction from key stakeholders, but I want to bring in Margaret Evans, who's based in London now as our senior international correspondent. But Margaret, for years, was our Middle East correspondent. So, Margaret, your perspective from that historical perspective is very important. But I want to get overall your assessment of the ruling. As I just mentioned, did not order a ceasefire. Many people thought that would have been impossible anyway. But going as far as it did with its rebuke of how Israel has been waging this war, what did you hear, and what are the key aspects of this ruling?
Well, I think that that's right. It was not an order for a ceasefire, as you say, but it was very clear, an indication that the expectation of the court is that Israel will conduct its war in a very different manner than it has up to now. Basically ensuring with immediate effect, said the court, that its military troops were not conducting anything that is covered or taking any action covered under the Genocide Act. And that's a long list, things like killing, grievous bodily harm, actions intended to destroy or to ensure the destruction of the group or the people, in this case, the Palestinians, obviously. The prevention of births. The rulings also included, again, with immediate action, a requirement for Israel to ensure humanitarian access. And throughout the hearing this morning, if you like, I'm not sure what you would call it, but the reading of the court's opinion, the judge, the Chief Judge Joe Donoghue, listed some of the reasoning behind the court's decision, as you said, taken with a large majority. And she relied heavily on documentation and reports by UN officials, including the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. And in those listings talked about some of the suffering and what we're witnessing on our screens of what's happening in Gaza. She talked about the injury to, again, quoting others in their reports, the injury to Palestinian children. She talked about a lost generation, about the forced displacement of nearly 2 million people, of the lack of access to potable water and to food supplies. So this was a very stark presentation of their decision-making process, in which she said that it was clear that the Palestinian population was very vulnerable, and also that there are indications that their situation could worsen. And in that, she used comments by the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, saying that this war is going to go on for many, many months. She also brought up, when she was talking about, one of the things that they were talking about was the prevention and punishment of direct incitement to genocide in Israel. And she quoted two examples, one from the Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, who said at some point when he was ordering the complete siege of Gaza City, we will eliminate everything. And he said that Israel was fighting human animals. She also mentioned the President, Isaac Herzog, saying, it is an entire nation out there that is responsible. Again, I just want to make clear that she's quoting reports from various UN agencies. Right. So it is a very significant ruling, obviously, but as you've pointed out, it's provisional.
Yes. Yes. I mean, we're years away from the final decision on whether or not it is genocide, according with the Genocide Convention of 1948. On that point, though, of incitement and comments, it was interesting. Yesterday, Israel made clear, Margaret, that it has taken measures. It has declassified documents. It has begun investigations, the Attorney General, in terms of statements that have been made that could be seen as inciting things. It's already made some overtures in those directions, but the court ruled those have not gone far enough. Those are insufficient in the court's ruling today. I want to come back to what you were mentioning, because not only have you been there historically, you have been one of our main reporters covering the war. So you have seen exactly what you're telling us about this morning, although access to Gaza is impossible, but seeing what has been happening with this fighting. And I would like your perspective on what the South African minister said. We haven't had a chance to assess her questions, but she said she would have liked a ceasefire order, that she would have wished that a cessation had been included in the decision, but she's satisfied because de facto it is a ceasefire. She said that Israel won't be able to comply with what the court is saying. It won't be able to ensure there is no more killing. It won't be able to ensure that the military abides by the Genocide Convention if it is not effectively a ceasefire. Is that on point, do you think? Do they get what they want, even though if it's not specifically written in the decision?
Well, it's assuming that military will comply, that Israel will comply. And that is not a given. There's no appeal to today's decisions. and this ruling in the interim before a decision is eventually made years down the road. But there's no actual way to enforce for the court, I guess, outside of public pressure. And so you can't necessarily guarantee that that's going to happen. And I think that there will be a lot of anger in Israel. And they will argue, again, they can argue, they have argued, clearly it didn't convince the court, that they are doing what they can to protect civilians. And you have to remember that the court has asked Israel to submit a report in 1 month's time on this. Mm-hmm. So we're waiting to see what the Israelis are going to say and do.
I do have some of that react. That's interesting. Yeah, she was just, again, I was interested in your perspective in that in order to deliver more aid, in order to reduce the death and destruction, it would require essentially a ceasefire. But the question of compliance remains. It is legally binding, but as Margaret points out, there is no appeal. And there is, Russia was ordered to stop its war in Ukraine, and Russia ignored that ruling in 2022. What will Israel do? Margaret, what we've had from Israel so far, the national security minister on the far right, he went on social media to say, hag schmag, so we've had mocking from him. We've also just had release from Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, also on social media, an official response, and it speaks very much to the issue of compliance. So let's listen to this together, Margaret. It runs about a minute, and then I'll get your perspective on it afterward.
Israel's commitment to international law is unwavering. Equally unwavering is our sacred commitment to continue to defend our country and defend our people. Like every country, Israel has an inherent right to defend itself. The vile attempt to deny Israel this fundamental right is blatant discrimination against the Jewish state, and it was justly rejected. The charge of genocide leveled against Israel is not only false, it's outrageous, and decent people everywhere should reject it. On the eve of the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, I again pledge as Israel's Prime Minister, never again. Israel will continue to defend itself against Hamas, a genocidal terror organization. On October 7th, Hamas perpetrated the most horrific atrocities against the Jewish people since the Holocaust, and it vows to repeat these atrocities again and again and again. Our war is against Hamas terrorists, not against Palestinian civilians. We will continue to facilitate humanitarian assistance and to do our utmost to keep civilians out of harm's way, even as Hamas uses civilians as human shields. We will continue to do what is necessary to defend our country and defend our people.
South Africa has said, Margaret, it is optimistic Israel will comply. As you heard, the Prime Minister call this whole case of genocide broadly not just false but outrageous. We will continue to defend ourselves. What do you think the likelihood of compliance is?
I think it will depend on what kind of pressure might come out of this internally. I think that many Israelis will see this as proof in their minds that the international community doesn't understand them. There has been long-term skepticism amongst many Israelis, and Prime Minister Netanyahu in particular is highly critical of the United Nations in general. So there's, that is going to come to play into their reaction and how he deals with this, which will be to other Israelis quite a shocking turn of events. But he's under an enormous amount of pressure in terms of criticism of his conduct of the war, because the hostages remain in the Gaza Strip. There are many people who would like to see him leave out of office, but they are in the midst of a war. He is accused by others of leading Israel down this path by failing to keep its military and intelligence services at the ready and to be able to anticipate this. He's accused of actually helping to build Hamas over the years by allowing funding through Qatar to make it into Hamas in the Gaza Strip. So it will depend on the pressure on him in that sense. But I think probably if I were having to bet, I don't think there would be compliance. I think you might see something greater efforts to ensure more humanitarian aid, something on the table. But there might be more pressure as well on Israel to agree to a pause or a ceasefire with Hamas if Hamas also were to agree to it. There's a lot of debate about what exactly is going on in those negotiations, and we see senior Americans coming back over this way. So, that might also come into play. I also just wanted to mention for many Palestinians, this ruling will, whether they seek compliance or not, I think go some way to making Palestinians feel seen in this, because many of them in Gaza feel that they haven't been seen, that the outside world isn't actually seeing and understanding their plight, and that will be of some comfort as this very brutal war continues. So, I'm sorry to say, but it's wait and see.
Yeah, very much so, Margaret. And you mentioned the pressure from within. We're also covering the pressure from outside, from allies, not just Canada, of course. Janice McGregor reporting on that, but we're waiting for some response from the Biden administration, the key ally to Israel, or the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who is traveling in Africa right now. On the point, not just of compliance, I'd like your perspective just before I let you go today. Again, Netanyahu, in rejecting the case and in saying that we will continue to defend ourselves, he's already said no one will stop us. And he's also, Margaret, continued to rebuff, even entreaties from the United States, that Israel move now toward a two-state solution. And we heard from the South African minister again at the conclusion of proceedings today. Hopefully this will be a decision that moves that process forward. What do you think is the likelihood of that?
Many Israeli analysts would tell you that a part of Netanyahu's strategy right now is to stay in power by prolonging the war. And they would say that one way to do that, they're actually critical of the United States for continuing to bring up the two-state solution, because they say it gives Prime Minister Netanyahu an excuse to scare Israelis about the prospect of that, because Israelis are still extremely traumatized by what happened on October 7th. They're not there yet in terms of envisaging how to live next to a Palestinian state that they believe wouldn't be able to guarantee their security. So that's what Israeli analysts would say on that front, that the two-state solution is basically what was behind Netanyahu's strategy vis-a-vis Hamas. We'll never have a two-state solution as long as the Palestinians are divided, so let's keep the Palestinians divided. So again, it comes down to pressure from the outside world, from countries like Canada, which have, supported the two-state solution and put money into, institution and state building in readiness for that eventuality into the West Bank, the occupied territories. Whether or not they're actually going to really put their money where their mouths are, or vice versa, and support this as what many people say is the only way out, the only way to really offer security to Israelis and a future to Palestinians. But of course, if everybody agreed on that, we would have had a two-state solution back in the 1990s, and we still don't. And I'm not sure that the prospect for it is really any closer.
Margaret, thank you. Just so people appreciate, Margaret's now our senior international correspondent, but has covered the war on the ground, the war between Israel and Hamas, and for years was our Middle East correspondent based in Jerusalem. So, Margaret, your expertise and insight is invaluable to me today, and I thank you for this conversation. Margaret Evans from our bureau in London on CBC Morning Live. It is Friday, January 26th. I'm Heather Hiscox. Good morning. We have breaking today: the United Nations World Court weighing in on Israel's war in Gaza. The court has delivered its interim ruling in the genocide case South Africa brought forward. It is calling for Israel to do more to protect civilians.
The court is acutely aware of the extent of the human tragedy that is unfolding in the region, and is deeply concerned about the continuing loss of life and human suffering.
The ruling stops short of ordering a ceasefire, but some of Israel's critics are hailing it as a victory for the rule of law. New hope for Gaza civilians. The court demands Israel allow more aid into the territory. How the ruling may help alleviate the ongoing humanitarian disaster. Israel responds with defiance. The Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, slams the ruling, saying his country is fighting a just war and will continue until absolute victory. We have special coverage for you this morning here on CBC News Network, an in-depth look at the landmark ruling this morning by the World Court on the war between Israel and Hamas, one that will have implications on a global scale. The International Court of Justice will not order Israel to stop the war immediately, to issue a ceasefire. But the 17 justices are ordering Israel to take action to protect and aid Palestinians in Gaza. As we've had for you live here on CBC Morning Live, the ruling was read out over about 40 minutes. It's the court's first response to the broad genocide case South Africa has brought forward. South Africa is accusing Israel of acting with genocidal intent. That broader case, that core question of genocide, will continue, but will likely be years before a final ruling from the IJC. So this is an interim decision, and in a key part of today's decision, the justices rule that it is plausible that genocidal acts could be happening in Gaza before that ruling. So the International Court of Justice says Israel must immediately take a number of steps, 6 emergency measures, to prevent any genocidal acts as the war continues. Here is first reaction from outside the court from a Palestinian representative.
This is a historic day. Palestine welcomes the momentous order by the International Court of Justice. This order means that the court recognized the gravity of the situation and was convinced by South Africa's compelling presentation that was based on law and fact that there are plausible cause to believe that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. It means that the cries and suffering of our people in Gaza have been heard in the Great Hall of Justice. Israel failed. It failed to convince the court to dismiss the complaint to prove that it is not deliberately violating Genocide Convention. The ICJ judges assessed the facts and the law and issued their order. Israel now will stand trial accused of committing the crime of all crimes. We call on states to ensure that all provisional measures ordered by the court are implemented. States and governments have clear obligations in light of this order. First and foremost, they must make sure they are not complicit in this genocide. This is a good day for humanity. This ruling is in favor of international system based on law and against exceptionalism and double standards.
So that is the reaction on the steps of the International Court of Justice in The Hague from Palestinian representation. They were there to support South Africa, which has brought the case forward. We have first reaction from Israel as well. The Israeli government has called the case against it spurious, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has bluntly stated Israel would not follow any ceasefire order from the World Court, that no one will stop us, not The Hague, nor the axis of evil, and no one else. Here is Benjamin Netanyahu in his reaction immediately following the announcement from the court as he posted it on social media last hour.
Israel's commitment to international law is unwavering. Equally unwavering is our sacred commitment to continue to defend our country and defend our people. Like every country, Israel has an inherent right to defend itself. The vile attempt to deny Israel this fundamental right is blatant discrimination against the Jewish state, and it was justly rejected. The charge of genocide leveled against Israel is not only false, it's outrageous, and decent people everywhere should reject it. On the eve of the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, I again pledge as Israel's Prime Minister, never again. Israel will continue to defend itself against Hamas, a genocidal terror organization. On October 7th, Hamas perpetrated the most horrific atrocities against the Jewish people since the Holocaust. and it vows to repeat these atrocities again and again and again. Our war is against Hamas terrorists, not against Palestinian civilians. We will continue to facilitate humanitarian assistance and to do our utmost to keep civilians out of harm's way, even as Hamas uses civilians as human shields. We will continue to do what is necessary to defend our country and defend our people.
That is Benjamin Netanyahu, as he posted just moments ago. And again, the key question, as we've discussed this morning, this is a legally binding ruling. There is no appeal of what the ICJ has ruled here in this provisional ruling. It's interim ruling. But there is no method of enforcement either. So the question now, what will Israel do, and will it comply? You heard some of what Benjamin Netanyahu's intention is in that statement just posted. We want you to hear some of the ruling itself. As I mentioned, you heard it live here on CBC Morning Live in the 7 o'clock Eastern language. It is very legalistic language, but that's important. The Chief Justice, the president of the court, references the Genocide Convention of 1948. But here she is laying out the court orders for Israel. These are orders, once again, the 6 emergency measures, the provisional measures that include taking steps to protect Palestinian civilians and ensuring that more humanitarian aid flows into Gaza.
For these reasons, the court indicates the following provisional measures. 1. By 15 votes to 2, the State of Israel shall, in accordance with its obligations under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, in relation to the Palestinians in Gaza, take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of all acts within the scope of Article 2 of the Convention, in particular, A, killing members of the group, B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, and D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group.
That is the president of the International Court of Justice. She is an American judge representing or presenting the opinion of the 17-judge panel. There were no unanimous decisions, but by very large majorities, the court has gone ahead with these 6 provisional measures and its orders to Israel. Let's bring in some initial reaction and assessment from our senior correspondent, Chris Brown, who is in Jerusalem.
Well, I think what's very key is going into this, Israel had said that this case that South Africa had brought was baseless. The United States had also said it was without merit. And the court has not ruled with them. They've in fact said there may indeed be merit, that some of what Israel has done in Gaza could possibly have broken the Genocide Convention. Now, they're saying that without prejudice in the sense that this case is going to go on for a very long time, possibly years, but at least on the very surface, they're almost like saying, look, you've established a prima facie case that you were correct to bring this, and there's at least something worthy here to look at. So I think at the very beginning, the Israeli government has lost that because, as I said, they wanted it thrown out. But on the other hand, as you just said, really, South Africa didn't get the key thing that it was asking for, and that was a suspension of the military campaign in Gaza. That perhaps is not so much of a surprise. They asked for 9 different provisional measures, and some of the other ones were granted. And just going through them, they have to take measures to improve the humanitarian situation. Well, Israel brought before the court evidence to show that it said shows that it was trying to improve the humanitarian situation, that it was allowing many hundreds of truckloads of aid going into Gaza. But in effect, the court is saying, well, you have to do more. You have to do more than that as well. It also said you have to preserve any evidence that might suggest that genocide happened. You have to keep records of it, and we're going to check up on you every month to make sure that you're doing that as well. And then they also suggested that you have to punish anyone who makes, let's say, genocidal remarks or incites people to genocide. And I think this is a very important point because in its ruling, the court pointed out some of the statements made not just by ordinary Israelis, but by the very most senior members of Israel's cabinet. Yoav Gallant, for example, the court cited his statement way back in October as saying when they began the invasion of Gaza. I have released all restraints. We are fighting human animals, he was quoted as saying. So the court invoked a number of these statements from senior Israeli ministers. So again, even though the South Africans did not get everything they wanted, much of this, I think, will be very embarrassing for the Israelis.
Chris, one more in terms of reaction from Israel's national security minister, who's part of the coalition government on the right wing of things, on X, so on social media. This is what he tweeted. His reaction: hag schmag, which lets you think that some of the members within the Netanyahu cabinet are I don't know what that cabinet meeting, how it will go, but there will be some very strong opposition to taking the action that the International Court of Justice has just issued. So not explicitly a ceasefire, but again, measures to refrain from any acts that could fall under the Genocide Convention, ensure that troops do not commit any genocidal acts, also improve the humanitarian situation. So today, Chris, what will you be reporting on? What specifically will you be looking for as far as next steps?
I think we should really keep an eye on these discussions going on between the United States, Qatar, and Israel involving a potential hostage deal with Hamas. We understand that the head of the CIA, William Burns, is going to be flying in this direction to Europe and to the Middle East to try to personally broker and get this done. Benjamin Netanyahu is under an immense amount of domestic pressure here now to try to free these remaining hostages. The exact number is not known. Possibly just over 100, but there's also some bodies of some hostages that have either died or have been killed. So we're going to be watching that because along with any possible hostage deal, there could come some kind of a pause, not using the word ceasefire, but some kind of a pause in the fighting. And how long will this be? There's been some suggestions it could be 2 months, some suggestions it could be 3 months, but it's going to be very, very interesting over the next number of days to see just how gelled up this goes. Hamas is asking for the release of all the prisoners, all the detainees that are now in Israeli jails. Those number in the thousands. So a ton of moving parts here, Heather.
That is our senior correspondent, Chris Brown, who is in Jerusalem and will be part of our coverage team through the day as we continue to bring you analysis of the International Court of Justice decision, this interim decision, and the reaction to it. Of course, the United States has been the most staunch supporter of Israel in the war and has shown unwavering support of its right to self-defense and of the operation since the October 7th attacks by Hamas. And now a lot of attention shifts to the Biden administration. What will its position be in light of the court ruling? What pressure will it bring to bear, if any, on Israel and how it conducts this war? Steve Futterman is actually in Washington to cover this for us. Steve, I'm glad to see you there in our bureau.
Yes.
The ICJ ruling, what could it mean for the United States?
Well, first of all, Heather, I think we should make it clear, I don't think the administration, U.S. officials are very surprised by what the World Court did. They did not expect the World Court to throw out the case like Israel wanted. They did not expect the World Court to call for a ceasefire. They did expect many of these provisional measures to be called for. And privately, many U.S. officials are going to be pleased with that. It may put some pressure on Israel. We have not had any reaction yet officially from the Biden administration or the State Department. We should get those later today. But again, I think privately, the administration will be pleased with some of these provisional demands that Israel allow more humanitarian aid. Yesterday at the State Department briefing, the spokesman said that the humanitarian aid, although it's going into Gaza, is extremely not sufficient enough. There needs to be more. So this will put some pressure on Israel. And, you know, the administrations over the years, it's not just the Biden administration. We have that famous Barack Obama comment about Benjamin Netanyahu. He is not easy to do business with at times for the American diplomats. They will, I think, be pleased that this will put some pressure on Israel to take some action. The optics obviously have been horrible, seeing all the buildings destroyed, seeing the numbers of civilians that have been killed, this according to the Hamas Minister of Information there. But it's obviously a large number of people. Thousands and thousands of Palestinians have been killed. The administration does not like that. So I think they will actually welcome some of the remarks from the World Court today.
You know, what we've heard from the United States on the overall, that core question of genocide is the case is meritless. That is what the United States has said. But in light of this interim ruling, Steve, when you mention what kind of action from the United States, will there be more pressure on Israel, on military aid, on money, on where do you think it might come, if at all?
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be pressure on military aid. There might be some behind-the-scenes discussions. Well, if you don't do this, we may consider this. But that's not really in the game right now. I think what Chris mentioned, the efforts to have not the ceasefire, but the pause. The ceasefire has other connotations. So a pause in the military action, I think that's something that Israel will be, I think, being at least discussed by the U.S. with Israel to consider it more fully, to work out some deal there. Basically, the U.S. has these three positions. One, that the idea of genocide is meritless. That has been an actual word used by the administration, meritless. But at the same time, the U.S. also feels there needs to be more humanitarian aid getting into Gaza right now. So that goes with what the court said. And I think, again, the U.S. will try to do the balancing act, the tap dancing that diplomats always do, that administrations try to do. The U.S. will continue to support Israel, will say Israel has a right to defend itself. But again, it has been disturbed by many of the images we've seen, many of the numbers of civilian deaths that we've seen. And again, I think part of the administration, don't know if they'll say this publicly, will welcome some of what the provisional measures have called for today.
Steve, thank you. Well, we'll await. I don't know if you've heard of anything formal from Biden himself, whether he's going to comment to this. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is traveling now.
Yes.
We haven't heard anything from him yet either, have we?
No, I think Blinken is most likely to be the person who will speak today when reporters get to him. And obviously, it will be a planned comment. They're going to work on that very carefully. But I think we may get something from the daily White House briefing, something perhaps from the State Department spokesman later today. Don't know if President Biden will actually say anything on this today.
Thank you so much, Steve. Really appreciate it. Obviously,
Thank
the
you, Heather.
Washington piece to this story is key. Steve Futterman in our bureau there. Now, let's show you, as we return to The Hague, the scene that was outside the court building, outside the World Court earlier this morning. Some of the demonstrators here, this is a pro-Palestinian group just across the street from the court. I can tell you a large crowd of supporters from Israel also there. Large numbers back on January the 11th and 12th when South Africa and Israel made their arguments before the court. Demonstrations were loud this morning, but not disruptive. And as far as reaction, initially what we're hearing from Palestinians, mixed. From officials, the Palestinian Foreign Ministry say they welcome the ruling because the court, quote, has ruled in favor of humanity and international law. Some of the Palestinian people, and particularly on social media, not satisfied with the judges. Essentially, they say they're offering hopes and prayers to the Palestinian people, criticizing them for not going far enough to order a ceasefire, to order a stop to the war. We continue to bring you more on the ruling and the reaction. You're watching CBC Morning Live.